There is a small island at the bottom of the world that most people have never thought twice about. It sits below the southeastern tip of Australia, separated from the mainland by a stretch of water that sailors used to call the most dangerous in the southern hemisphere. The winds that roar across that channel come uninterrupted from Antarctica. The waves can reach 30 feet. Ships have gone down in those waters without leaving so much as a timber behind. And yet, despite all of that, despite the isolation and the cold and the near impenetrable wilderness that covers most of the island's interior, Tasmania became one of the wealthiest corners of the British Empire in less than a generation. Not over decades of careful colonial investment, not through the slow accumulation of agricultural surplus. It happened fast, suspiciously fast. And the families at the center of that wealth appeared with a completeness that should have raised questions then and has somehow never quite raised enough questions since. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The official story of Tasmania in the 1820s is a clean one. Britain had established a penal colony at Hobart Town in 1804. Free settlers began arriving in larger numbers from around 1812 onward. By the 1820s, the colony was beginning to find its feet. Wool production was expanding. Wheat was being grown in the Derwent Valley. A handful of prominent families had carved out large land grants and were building the foundations of a pastoral economy that would define the island for the next century. That is the version in the history books. It moves at the pace of colonial enterprise, plodding and sensible, one cleared acre at a time. But if you sit with the actual records from that period, a different picture starts to emerge. Not a picture that contradicts the official story outright, but one that sits beside it, slightly out of alignment, like a shadow that doesn't quite match the object casting it. The wealth that appeared in Van Diemen's Land, which was Tasmania's name until 1856, was not proportional to what the colony had actually produced in the years leading up to the 1820s. The buildings being constructed, the livestock being acquired, the land being consolidated into enormous estates that rivaled anything in the English countryside, all of it implied a level of capital that should not have existed in a penal outpost at the edge of the known world. And the families at the center of it, the names that appear over and over in the land grants, the wool receipts, the shipping manifests, the government contracts, the early banking records. Some of them have origins that are documented in detail. You can trace them back to England or Scotland or Ireland, follow their ships, find their berths, read their letters home. But some of them don't trace back quite so cleanly. Some of them arrive in Tasmania with money that has no obvious source, with connections that seem to have materialized fully formed, with an ease in their new circumstances that suggests they were not, in fact, starting over. That is the thread this story is going to pull, not with sensationalism, not with the kind of breathless certainty that pastes every loose end onto a single conspiracy, but slowly, carefully, the way you would approach a house you weren't sure was occupied. Because the thing about Tasmania in the 1820s is that nobody questions it, not really. It sits in Australian history as a footnote to a footnote, overshadowed by the larger story of New South Wales, by the drama of the First Fleet, by the eventually more famous development of Victoria and Queensland. Tasmania's early colonial period gets a paragraph in most surveys of Australian history, sometimes less, and that neglect has allowed some very strange details to remain exactly where they were left, unexamined, in the margins of the record. Let's start with the geography, because geography explains a great deal about why this island was what it was in the early 19th century. Tasmania is not a hospitable place if what you want is easy agricultural land. The interior is dominated by a central plateau that sits at over 1,000 meters in places, covered by buttongrass plains and ancient conifer forests and lakes that seem to have no business existing in the middle of a landmass that small. The coastal fringes are more workable, particularly in the southeast around the Derwent Estuary and in the north around the Tamar River Valley. But even there, the weather is capricious. Frosts come late into spring. Rain falls in ways that seem to bear no particular relationship to the season. The soil in some areas is genuinely productive, but it requires clearing and draining and amendment before it will behave. This is not the kind of environment that produces a land rush. This is not the kind of environment that attracts speculators looking for a quick fortune. And yet, in the 1820s, something very much like a land rush occurred in Van Diemen's Land. Lieutenant Governor William Sorel presided over the colony from 1817 to 1824, and during his tenure, the number of free settlers increased dramatically. Land grants were distributed at a pace that surprised even London, and the colony began to generate export revenue in quantities that drew attention from merchants in Sydney and investors in Britain. His successor, George Arthur, who governed from 1824 to 1836, oversaw the full flowering of that early wealth, the construction of substantial properties, the establishment of fine wool merinos as the colony's primary commercial product, and the consolidation of what amounted to a colonial aristocracy in a place that had existed for barely 20 years. 20 years. Think about that for a moment. 20 years from a penal settlement struggling to feed itself to a colony with a landed gentry, with grand houses, with merchant networks connecting it to London and Calcutta and the Cape Colony and the ports of South America. The agricultural and pastoral development of a colony does not typically move at that pace. New South Wales, which had a 15-year head start and far more accessible land and a much larger population, was still finding its feet economically in the same period. The establishment of genuine wealth, the kind of wealth that builds stone houses and fills them with imported furniture, and maintains a staff and educates children in the colonial equivalents of public schools, that kind of wealth is normally the product of at least one, usually two or three, generations of sustained effort. In Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s, it appeared in one. The wool industry is usually cited as the explanation, and wool is certainly part of the picture. The merino sheep that John MacArthur had introduced to New South Wales had begun spreading south, and Tasmania's cool climate and temperate pastures proved genuinely excellent for fine wool production. The prices that Tasmanian wool commanded in London in the 1820s were real. The export figures are in the records. But those export figures, impressive as they were for a small colony, do not account for the built environment that was being created at the same time. The construction of houses like Clarendon and Brickenden and Woolmers, properties that would not have looked out of place in the English home counties, required capital on a scale that wool profits from a few years of production simply cannot explain. Clarendon is worth dwelling on for a moment. It was built in the late 1830s by James Cox, but it represents the culmination of a process of wealth accumulation that had begun in the 1820s. The house is neoclassical in its proportions, with a facade that belongs to a tradition of English country house architecture that takes money and confidence and a very particular kind of social aspiration to attempt in any context, let alone in a British colony on the southern fringe of the world. The estate around it encompassed thousands of acres of improved pasture, a working mill, farm buildings of a quality that most English tenant farmers would have envied. Where did the capital for this come from? Cox's family background in England was not particularly distinguished. He arrived in the colony in 1823. Within a decade, he had built one of the most significant rural properties in the Southern Hemisphere. He was not alone. The 1820s and 1830s in Van Diemen's Land produced a cluster of wealthy families with a speed and completeness that stands apart from the general pattern of colonial development. The Archers at Longford, the Prestons, the Kermode family at Mona Vale, the Henty brothers who moved between the mainland and the island in ways that complicate the usual narrative, and, above them all in terms of sheer economic and political influence, the networks that surrounded men like Edward Kerr and the overlapping family connections that tied the major pastoral dynasties to each other and to the colonial administration in ways that were never fully transparent to the ordinary settlers who existed in their shadow. Edward Kerr is a figure who deserves more attention than he typically receives in accounts of early Tasmanian history. He arrived in the colony as the chief agent of the Van Diemen's Land Company, a private corporation that had been granted over 500,000 acres of the island's northwest in 1825. The company's origins are themselves worth examining. It was established by a group of London investors and promoted enthusiastically by people with connections to the British government at a moment when the Colonial Office was actively looking for ways to develop Van Diemen's Land beyond its purely penal function. The land grant it received was extraordinary in its scale. 514,000 acres of the northwest corner of the island, an area that had barely been explored at the time the grant was made, handed to a private company with capital that had been raised partly through public subscription and partly through what the prospectus described as private investment from parties with an interest in colonial development. Who those parties were is not entirely clear. The company's records exist in various archives, but they have never been subjected to the kind of sustained forensic analysis that might reveal the full picture of where its initial capital came from. What is clear is that the Van Diemen's Land Company represented a transfer of colonial resources, specifically land and the labor of convicts assigned to work it, to private hands on a scale that had no precedent in Australian history at the time. And the men who ran it locally, Kerr First and his successors, exercised a degree of economic and social power in the northwest of the island that effectively made them a private government within the colonial government. This is where the story starts to get strange, in ways that the official histories tend not to address directly. The Van Diemen's Land Company's operations in the northwest were, by the company's own internal assessments, largely unsuccessful for the first decade of their existence. The northwest was heavily forested, difficult to clear, and the company's agricultural ambitions repeatedly ran into the reality of the landscape, and yet the company continued to receive backing. London investors, who might have been expected to withdraw their capital, continued to support an enterprise that was, by any conventional measure, not performing. The labour assigned to it, convict labour that the colonial government provided at the company's request, was expensive to manage and not always suited to the kind of heavy agricultural clearing the company needed. The returns were modest. The promises made in the original prospectus were not being met, and yet the company survived, and the men associated with it, Kerr and the network of agents and sub-managers and connected families that grew up around its operations, they thrived. Not from the company's declared income, not from the wool and cattle and timber that the company's accounts showed being produced on its vast holdings. They thrived in ways that the records partially document and partially obscure, in ways that require you to look not just at what the records say, but at the gaps between what they say and what they imply. One of those gaps has to do with shipping. Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s was not just a destination for ships bringing free settlers and supplies from Britain, it was also a stopping point on several significant trading routes. Ships travelling between India and the Cape Colony and the Pacific often called at Hobart Town for water and provisions and repairs. Ships engaged in the Pacific trade, the complex network of commerce that connected the ports of South America with the whaling grounds of the Southern Ocean and the emerging markets of the Pacific Islands, frequently used the Derwent Estuary as a waypoint. And the Bass Strait, the stretch of water between Tasmania and the mainland, was becoming increasingly important as a route for vessels moving between Port Jackson and the ports of the Southwest Pacific. This traffic brought opportunity. It also brought ambiguity. The line between legitimate trade and the various forms of commerce that operated just outside legal boundaries was not always clearly drawn in the 1820s, and it was drawn even less clearly in Van Diemen's Land than it was in the more closely watched environment of New South Wales. The colonial administration in Hobart had limited capacity to monitor what moved in and out of its ports. The customs apparatus was understaffed and, at times, compromised by the same networks of personal connection that governed most other aspects of colonial life. Goods arrived and departed, whose origin and destination were recorded in the customs books with a degree of vagueness that was, by the standards of the time, unremarkable. Sealing and whaling were the official explanations for much of this maritime activity, and sealing and whaling were real industries. The Bass Strait sealing gangs had been operating since the earliest years of the colony, conducting a trade in skins and oil that connected Van Diemen's Land to markets in China and India. The whaling industry that used Hobart as a base was genuine and substantial. But sealing and whaling also provided cover. The vessels that moved in and out of the Bass Strait and the Southern Ocean were not always easily distinguished from vessels engaged in other forms of trade, and the men who owned them were not always inclined to draw that distinction for the benefit of customs officials who had every incentive to accept the explanation offered. What else might have been moving through those waters? That is the question that Tasmanian historians have occasionally approached and then retreated from, because the answer requires engaging with evidence that is fragmentary and suggestive rather than definitive. But the fragments are there, and they point in a direction that is worth following, even if the path becomes uncertain. The decade between 1810 and 1820 was a turbulent one in the Pacific. The Spanish Empire in South America was collapsing under the pressure of independence movements that would, by 1825, have freed most of the continent from colonial rule. The chaos of that collapse disrupted established trade patterns and created opportunities for those willing to operate in the gray zones of international commerce. Silver that had moved through official Spanish channels for centuries was suddenly moving through unofficial ones. Goods that had been produced in the interior of South America and shipped through official Spanish ports were now being moved by anyone with access to a vessel and a willing buyer. The ports of the River Plate, of Chile, of Peru, were in varying states of disorder, and disorder in port cities has historically been very good for the kind of merchant who prefers not to have his cargo examined too carefully. Tasmania was not far from this disruption by the standards of the time. A ship could make the run from Valparaiso to Hobart Town in 3 to 4 weeks under favorable conditions. The Southern Ocean route was difficult but well established, and the Bass Strait, with its network of small islands and inlets, and its history of sealing activity that had accustomed local administrators to the presence of vessels whose exact movements were difficult to track, offered a geography that was, from a certain perspective, exceptionally convenient. The wealth that appeared in Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s may have had roots in this disrupted Pacific commerce. Not necessarily in piracy, which is the dramatic explanation and therefore the one that tends to be reached for too quickly. The more plausible explanation is that some of the capital that funded the great Tasmanian estates came from the kind of trade that could not be openly declared, the kind that required the proceeds to be laundered through legitimate activity before they could be invested in land and buildings and respectable commercial enterprise. Wool was perfect for this. Wool was the legitimate face of a colonial economy, the thing that could be pointed to when anyone asked where the money came from. It was also a genuinely profitable activity, which made the explanation more convincing. This is speculation, and it is worth saying so clearly. There is no document that records a Tasmanian pastoralist acknowledging that the capital he used to purchase his first sheep run came from undeclared Pacific commerce. There is no shipping manifest that says in plain terms what some vessels were actually carrying. But the circumstantial evidence, the pace of wealth accumulation, the maritime connections, the gaps in the accounting, the Pacific disruptions of exactly the right period, all of it points in a consistent direction. And there is one more piece of circumstantial evidence that is worth introducing here, because it is the piece that most clearly distinguishes the Tasmanian case from the ordinary story of colonial wealth accumulation. The families that dominated Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s and 1830s were extraordinarily good at staying connected to each other. The intermarriage patterns among the major pastoral dynasties were not unusual for the colonial period, but the speed with which those marriages were arranged in a colony that had existed for barely 20 years suggests something more than the natural tendency of prosperous families to consolidate their interests through matrimonial alliance. It suggests that these families already knew each other before Tasmania, that they had relationships that preceded their arrival in the colony, that the social network they created in Van Diemen's Land was not built in Van Diemen's Land but was simply transplanted there from some prior context. That prior context is difficult to identify with certainty. Some of the connections are explicable through the obvious channels. Men who had served in the same regiments, men who had come from the same counties in England, men who had attended the same schools, or had brothers who had married cousins of men who ended up in the same colony. Colonial societies naturally generated these kinds of overlapping connection. But some of the connections in early Tasmania run deeper than can be explained by shared county of origin or military service, or the ordinary social machinery of the English upper middle class. Some of them look like the connections of men who had done something together before they became respectable pastoralists, something that required trust and discretion and the willingness to present a coherent front to anyone who asked questions. James Gordon, who established himself in the Tamar Valley in the early 1820s and whose property became one of the significant wool-producing estates of the colonial period, arrived in the colony with a level of liquid capital that his documented background in Scotland does not fully account for. His father had been a modest merchant. He had no inheritance that appears in the Scottish records. He had been in India for several years before coming to Van Diemen's Land, which is important because India in the early 19th century was a place where men of flexible commercial morality could accumulate capital through channels that did not always leave clear records. The East India Company's private trade provisions allowed individual company servants to engage in commerce on their own account, and the definition of what constituted legitimate private trade was elastic enough that the line between official company business and personal enrichment was frequently crossed without formal acknowledgement. India was also connected to the Pacific trade networks in ways that are directly relevant to this story. The trade in Bengal opium, which was moving in large quantities to China in the first decades of the 19th century, intersected with the commercial routes that also connected to the Bass Strait and the Southern Ocean. Ships that moved opium eastward often returned westward with cargo that included the produce of the Pacific trade. The men who ran these operations were not pirates. They were merchants, some of them very respectable ones, operating within a system whose full complexity was rarely acknowledged in any single document because the acknowledgement of that complexity was not in anyone's interest. Gordon's time in India placed him within reach of this system. His subsequent appearance in Van Diemen's Land with capital sufficient to purchase land and establish a pastoral operation does not require that he personally participated in anything illegal. It requires only that he knew people who did, and that those people were willing to invest in a colonial enterprise that offered a safe and legitimate destination for capital of ambiguous origin. The colony itself was, from this perspective, an ideal investment. Land in Van Diemen's Land was cheap in the 1820s, available in large quantities through the government's land grant system, and was converting rapidly into a productive pastoral asset, as merino sheep spread across the cleared and improved grasslands of the Derwent and Tamar valleys. The returns on wool were real and growing. The colony was stable enough, under the firm governance of first Sorrel and then Arthur, to protect property rights and honour commercial agreements. And it was far enough from London that the details of any individual's financial history were difficult to verify. That distance matters more than it might initially seem. The administrative connection between Van Diemen's Land and London in the 1820s was a slow one. A letter sent from Hobart to the Colonial Office took 4 to 6 months to arrive. Instructions sent in response took another 4 to 6 months to return. In that interval of nearly a year, a great deal could happen, and a great deal could be arranged. The colonial administration could grant land on terms that had not been explicitly authorized. Commercial arrangements could be established and consolidated before anyone in London had an opportunity to question them. Social positions could be created and filled before the metropolitan authorities had any clear picture of who the people occupying those positions actually were. George Arthur, the lieutenant governor who presided over the colony's most critical years of economic development, from 1824 to 1836, was himself a figure of considerable complexity. He is remembered primarily for his management of the convict system, which he administered with a systematic efficiency that made Van Diemen's Land the most thoroughly surveilled penal colony in the British Empire. His assignment record, The register he maintained of every convict in the colony and the details of their labor assignments was a bureaucratic achievement that has no real parallel in contemporary colonial administration. But Arthur's meticulous record-keeping in relation to convicts existed alongside a more selective documentation of the colony's economic development. The land grants he authorized, the commercial arrangements he permitted, the patterns of assignment by which convict labor was distributed among the colony's free settlers, all of this created a system that substantially benefited a relatively small group of men who were, in various ways, connected to Arthur himself. Arthur had been in the Caribbean before he came to Van Diemen's Land. He had served as superintendent of British Honduras, where he had developed both his administrative skills and a familiarity with the kind of colonial economy that operated on the margins of official regulation. The timber trade in British Honduras, the logwood and mahogany cutting operations that supplied the cabinet makers and dye manufacturers of Britain and Europe, was run through a complex system of land, tenure, and labor that existed in perpetual tension with formal imperial authority. The men who grew wealthy in British Honduras did so partly through legitimate timber production and partly through their management of a labor system that was, in its practical operation, very different from what it appeared to be in official accounts. Arthur brought some of that experience with him to Van Diemen's Land. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the general understanding of how a colonial economy could be managed in ways that served certain interests very efficiently while appearing, from a distance, to be a model of orderly administration. His land grant system in Van Diemen's Land has been criticized by historians for the degree to which it concentrated land in the hands of a relatively small number of grantees, but that criticism has generally been framed in terms of policy failure rather than deliberate design. The possibility that the concentration was deliberate, that it served the specific purpose of creating a class of substantial landowners whose economic interests would align with the maintenance of the existing order and the protection of the existing administration, has not been fully explored. The labor system is inseparable from this story. Convict assignment. The practice by which transported convicts were assigned as unpaid laborers to free settlers who provided their food and clothing in exchange for their work, was the foundation of the colonial economy in Van Diemen's Land. It was also, in practice, a system of enormous complexity and considerable opacity. The assignment records, which Arthur kept so carefully, recorded the formal arrangements. They did not record the informal economy that operated alongside them. The deals struck between settlers over the movement of convict workers. The payments made and received for convict services that did not appear in the official accounts. The ways in which convict labor was used to produce value that did not appear in any official production record. This informal economy was significant. A pastoral property in the 1820s ran on convict labor. The building of fences, the clearing of land, the driving of stock, the construction of outbuildings, and eventually of the substantial houses that became the defining architectural achievements of the colonial period. All of this was done by convicts assigned from the government's labor pool. The cost of that labor to the settler was minimal. The value it produced was substantial. And the gap between the cost and the value was the foundation on which the Tasmanian pastoral fortunes were built. But there was more to it than that. Convict labor was not only used to build and farm, it was also used in the maritime industries that connected Van Diemen's Land to the wider Pacific economy. Convicts worked on the sealing vessels that moved through the Bass Strait. They worked in the whaling industry that used Hobart as a base. They worked in the timber operations that supplied the colony's building needs, and, increasingly, the export trade in timber that connected Van Diemen's Land to the markets of India and the Cape. In all of these industries, the formal records of production and trade sit alongside an informal reality that is only partially visible in the surviving documentation. The sealing trade is perhaps the clearest example. The Bass Strait sealing industry had developed in the earliest years of the 19th century, conducted by a loose network of men who operated with a minimum of official oversight and a maximum of commercial flexibility. The sealers were, in many respects, the first free economy of the Australian colonies. They moved between islands, they traded with each other and with vessels from New South Wales and from overseas, and they accumulated knowledge of the Southern Ocean and its resources that gave them a significant advantage over any official authority attempting to regulate their activities. They were also, by the standards of the time, rough men operating in rough conditions, and the records of their activities are fragmentary precisely because they had little interest in documentation. But some of the men who built the early Tasmanian fortunes had direct connections to the sealing trade, not always as sealers themselves, but as financiers and suppliers and buyers of the product. The seal oil and seal skins that the Bass Strait gangs produced had to be processed and marketed by someone, and the men who performed that function occupied a position that was both commercially valuable and informationally advantageous. They knew the trade routes. They knew the operators. They knew which vessels were doing what in those waters, and that knowledge was valuable in ways that went beyond the legitimate commerce in seal oil and skins. This is the texture of the world in which the Tasmanian fortunes were assembled. Not a simple story of industrious settlers clearing land and growing wool, but a complex web of legitimate and semi-legitimate and occasionally illegitimate commercial activity, all of it operating in a context where the official mechanisms of oversight and regulation were chronically understaffed and often compromised by the same personal connections that characterized every other aspect of colonial life. The question of where the money came from is therefore not a simple one to answer. It came from multiple sources, some of them clearly legitimate, some of them legally ambiguous, and some of them almost certainly outside what any formal accounting would have acknowledged. What the money shared, regardless of its origin, was the need for a legitimate destination. And the pastoral estates of Van Diemen's Land provided exactly that. Land was real. Wool was real. Buildings were real. The transformation of ambiguous capital into clear pastoral wealth was, in the 1820s and 1830s, a process that required only the willingness to invest in the colony and the patience to let the legitimate activities of the estate gradually replace the original source of capital in the accounting of one's fortune. The men who managed this transformation were not, for the most part, villains, or at least they were not villains in any simple sense. They were men operating in a period when the rules of commercial behavior were less clearly defined than they would later become, when the mechanisms for enforcing those rules were weak and distant, and when the rewards for flexibility were substantial. The colonial frontier has always attracted men of this kind, and the frontier of Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s was frontier in the fullest sense, not just geographically, but institutionally and morally. What makes the Tasmanian case worth examining more closely than the general colonial frontier story is the specific pattern that emerges when you look at the families involved. The wealth is concentrated among a relatively small group. That group is internally connected by marriage and business relationships in ways that suggest prior acquaintance. The wealth appears at a speed that the documented activities of the colony cannot fully account for, and the families concerned have, collectively, managed to avoid the sustained scrutiny that their prominence in the early colonial period might have been expected to attract. Part of the reason for that avoidance has to do with the subsequent history of Tasmania itself. The island's economic development did not follow the trajectory of the mainland colonies. The gold rushes of the 1850s, which brought enormous attention and enormous numbers of people to Victoria and New South Wales, largely bypassed Tasmania. The pastoral wealth of the colonial period persisted, but it was gradually overtaken in importance by the development of the mainland, and Tasmanian history became, in the broader Australian national consciousness, a secondary story. The descendants of the families who had built the colonial fortunes remained prominent locally, but their prominence did not translate into the kind of national visibility that might have attracted sustained historical investigation. The other reason has to do with the nature of the archives. The records of early Van Diemen's Land are extensive, but uneven. The convict records, which Arthur's administration maintained with such care, are remarkably complete. The records of land grants and property transactions are reasonably well preserved. But the commercial records, the shipping documents, the account books of the early trading operations, the correspondence of the merchant houses that connected the colony to its markets. These are fragmentary. Many have been lost. Some may have been deliberately destroyed. And the gaps in the commercial record are precisely the gaps that would illuminate the origins of the colonial fortunes. What survives allows you to see the outcomes without always being able to trace the processes that produced them. You can see that a man arrived in the colony in 1823 with capital sufficient to purchase land and establish a pastoral operation. You cannot always see where that capital came from. You can see that families connected to the sealing and whaling industries built substantial fortunes in the 1820s and 1830s. You cannot always see the full range of activities that those industries covered. You can see that the major pastoral dynasties were connected to each other by marriage and by commercial partnership in ways that gave them a collective economic and political power disproportionate to their numbers. You cannot always see exactly when and where those connections were established. But the absence of a clear paper trail is itself informative, in the same way that a house without windows tells you something about the people who built it. Let's take a different angle on this story, because there is another dimension to the wealth of 1820s Tasmania that deserves attention and that points toward a set of questions that are, if anything, more uncomfortable than the question of where the money came from. The land on which the Tasmanian pastoral fortunes were built was not empty when the pastoralists arrived. The Aboriginal people of Van Diemen's Land, the Palawa, had occupied the island for at least 35,000 years. They were not, as colonial ideology preferred to imagine them, nomads with no particular relationship to any specific territory. They had complex relationships with specific landscapes, specific seasonal resources, specific ceremonial sites. The grasslands that made the Derwent and Tamar valleys so attractive for merino sheep were in many cases grasslands that the Palawa had maintained through generations of careful burning, a landscape management practice that created the open, grassy environments that the colonial settlers found so convenient. The dispossession of the Palawa is one of the darkest chapters in Australian history, and it was carried out with a speed and thoroughness in Van Diemen's Land that was shocking even by the standards of the colonial period. The Black War, as the conflict between settlers and Aboriginal people came to be known, reached its peak in the late 1820s and the early 1830s, exactly the period when the pastoral fortunes were being consolidated. The connection between those two facts is direct and inescapable. The land that was being granted to free settlers and that was being put to use as sheep runs was land from which its previous inhabitants were being driven through a combination of settler violence, disease, and ultimately the organized roundup known as the Black Line of 1830, in which virtually the entire non-Aboriginal population of the settled districts was mobilized to drive the remaining Palawa populations into the Tasman Peninsula. This is not a secret. The history of the Black War is documented, researched, and increasingly acknowledged in contemporary Australian discourse. But it is rarely placed in direct relationship with the story of the colonial fortunes. The wealth that the great Tasmanian estates represented was built partly on the labour of convicts, and partly on the occupation of land that had been made available through the violent dispossession of the people who had used and managed it for tens of thousands of years. The pastoral ideal of the Tasmanian colonial period, the image of stone houses and improved pastures and fine wool and comfortable domesticity, rested on foundations of coercion and violence that the official narratives of colonial prosperity have consistently preferred not to foreground. The men who built those fortunes knew this. Some of them participated directly in the violence of the frontier. Others maintained a comfortable distance, living in their substantial houses while the fighting happened somewhere beyond their immediate horizon. But all of them benefited from it. The grants that Arthur distributed so generously in the 1820s were grants of land that the colonial government claimed under the legal fiction of terra nullius, the doctrine that the land belonged to no one because its occupants did not use it in the way that European law recognized as constituting ownership. That doctrine was, in retrospect, both wrong and self-serving. But it was the legal framework that made the land grants possible. And without the land grants, there were no pastoral estates. And without the pastoral estates, there was no Tasmanian colonial wealth. This dimension of the story does not make the question of where the capital came from any less interesting, but it complicates the picture in important ways. The fortunes of 1820s Tasmania were assembled from at least three distinct elements: capital of various and not always clearly documented origins, land that was available because of the violent dispossession of its previous inhabitants, and labor that was extracted from convicts through a system that was, at its core, a form of coerced service. The combination of those three elements produced the pastoral wealth of the colonial period with a speed and on a scale that the official story, which tends to emphasize the legitimate agricultural and pastoral activities of the free settlers, does not adequately explain. The question of who benefited most from this combination is not complicated. The names that appear in the records of the major land grants, the names that appear as members of the colonial councils and magistrates' benches and church vestries and wool agents' correspondence, are the names of the families that consolidated the pastoral fortunes. They were a small group. They were well connected to each other and to the colonial administration. And they constructed, in the space of a generation, a social order that proved remarkably durable. The descendants of the families that dominated Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s remained prominent in Tasmanian life well into the 20th century. The properties they built are now heritage sites. The churches they endowed are still standing. The social institutions they created persisted long after the conditions that produced them had changed beyond recognition. The durability of that order is part of what makes the origins of the fortunes that created it so interesting. If the money had simply been earned in the straightforward manner that the official story implies, there would be no particular mystery about where it came from. Wool was profitable. Land was cheap. Labor was essentially free. Given those conditions, a competent farmer with adequate initial capital could build a substantial estate in a generation. That much is true. But the question of adequate initial capital keeps coming back. Because for some of these families, the initial capital appears to have been not merely adequate but substantial, and its origin is not always clear. One place to look for partial answers is in the shipping records of the period. The vessels that called at Hobart Town in the 1820s are recorded in the colonial newspapers, which began publication in the colony in 1810 and continued with increasing regularity through the decades that followed. The Hobart Town Gazette, the Colonial Times, and their successors provide a reasonably complete record of shipping movements in and out of the Derwent estuary. What those records show, when examined in detail, is a pattern of commercial activity that is more complex than the official story of wool exports and supply ship arrivals would suggest. There are vessels in those records that appear once or twice and then vanish from the Tasmanian record without any clear account of where they went or what they were carrying. There are voyages described with a vagueness that seems, in retrospect, deliberate. There are arrivals by vessels whose last port of call is listed as a port that is, in a geographical sense, significantly out of the way for a ship supposedly engaged in the legitimate commerce between Britain and the Australian colonies. And there are departures whose cargo descriptions are so general, so lacking in the specific detail that legitimate commercial shipments typically generated, that they raise questions about whether the cargo listed in the newspaper's shipping report was the full cargo being carried. None of this is definitive. Newspaper shipping reports of the 1820s were not always accurate or complete, and the vagueness of some of them reflects the limited information available to the newspaper's editor as much as any deliberate concealment by the vessel's owners. But taken together with the other elements of the picture, the rapid wealth accumulation, the prior connections among the major families, the gaps in the commercial records, the maritime geography that made Van Diemen's Land a convenient stopping point for vessels engaged in Pacific commerce, the shipping records add to the overall impression that the economic history of the colony in this period has not been fully told. The whaling industry deserves a closer look, because it was the most significant of the legitimate maritime industries associated with Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s, and because it connected the colony to the widest range of international commercial networks. American whalers, British whalers, French whalers, and vessels from various other nations used Hobart Town as a provisioning and repair stop throughout this period. The town that grew up around the whaling industry was, by the standards of a small colonial settlement at the edge of the world, an internationally connected place. Sailors and merchants and agents from multiple countries moved through it. Information and goods and capital moved with them. The connections between the whaling industry and the leading figures of the colonial economy in Van Diemen's Land are real and documented, though not always in the detail one might wish. Men like Alexander Birch, who was among the more prominent of the early free settlers, and who built connections to the colonial administration while also maintaining commercial interests that extended into the maritime sector, represent a type that was common in the early colony. The boundaries between pastoral wealth, maritime commerce, and official position were not firmly drawn. The same men who sat on the magistrate's bench and managed the distribution of convict labor assignments also had interests in the vessels that used Hobart as a base, and in the trade that those vessels conducted. Alexander Birch's family connections are particularly interesting in this context. His son, Thomas Lodge Murray Pryor, who took a different name following an inheritance, ended up in Queensland and became one of the significant figures in the development of that colony. The movement of individuals and capital from the Tasmanian colonial establishment to the subsequent frontier zones of the Australian mainland is a pattern that has been noted by historians but not fully analysed. The men who built the Tasmanian fortunes in the 1820s and 1830s did not simply stay in Tasmania. Their descendants and their associates moved outward as the frontier of Australian settlement advanced, carrying with them the capital and the commercial relationships and the social and political networks that had been established in the original colonial context. This movement complicates the picture in another way. It means that the influence of the original Tasmanian fortunes was not limited to the island. The networks that had been established in Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s extended into Queensland, into Victoria, into New South Wales, and through those connections into the broader networks of Australian commerce and politics in the second half of the 19th century. Some of the significant pastoral and commercial families of the Australian mainland had their roots, directly or through marriage, in the Tasmanian colonial establishment. Tracing those roots back to their origins takes you, repeatedly, to the same period of ambiguous wealth accumulation in the 1820s. There is a broader context for all of this that is worth establishing, because the Tasmanian case, distinctive as it is, did not occur in isolation. The decade of the 1820s was, across the British Empire, a period of significant capital formation in colonial contexts. The financial dislocations of the Napoleonic Wars, which had ended in 1815, had left large amounts of capital seeking new outlets. The colonial world, from the Caribbean to India to the Australian settlements, offered those outlets in the form of land, labor, and commodity production. The investors who put money into colonial ventures in this period were not always orthodox financiers operating through established channels. They included men who had accumulated capital through the wartime economy, which had created opportunities for profit in activities ranging from naval provisioning to currency speculation to the various forms of trade that the disruption of normal commercial patterns made possible. Some of that capital found its way to Van Diemen's Land. The question of how much of it arrived through channels that would not have survived close scrutiny is, by definition, difficult to answer precisely. But the overall context makes it plausible that some of the capital that funded the Tasmanian pastoral expansion was, in its origins, at least partly the product of the economic dislocations of the Napoleonic period. The wars created winners as well as losers, and some of the winners were men who had profited from the chaos in ways that peace and the return of official scrutiny made it prudent to invest in activities far removed from the original source of the profit. Tasmania, remote and newly developing, was exactly the kind of place where capital of that kind could be put to use without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Let's spend some time with the landscape itself, because the landscape of Tasmania is, in an important sense, a character in this story, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the events of the 1820s took the specific form they did. The eastern half of Tasmania, the settled districts that the colonial administration was expanding through the 1820s and 1830s, is a landscape of rolling hills and river valleys that, under the right conditions, does indeed resemble the English countryside. The Derwent River runs north from Mount Field through a broad valley of good soil before turning south and east toward the estuary at Hobart. The Midlands region between Hobart and Launceston is a plateau country of grassland and woodland that, once the native bush had been cleared or burned, proved excellent for sheep. The Tamar Valley in the north, running down to Launceston and the tidal waters of Port Dalrymple, is another zone of productive land that attracted settlers early. The native vegetation that covered most of this country before European settlement was not the continuous dense forest that the western and southern parts of the island supported. In the Midlands and the river valleys, the landscape was more open, maintained by the burning practices of the Palawa, in a state that was, for a grazier with sheep, genuinely attractive. The tussock grasses of the native grasslands were not as nutritious as improved English pasture species, but they were extensive, and they could support substantial numbers of stock on a relatively light management regime. The transition from native grassland to improved English pasture, which was the agricultural project of the 1820s and 1830s, required capital for clearing and fencing, and for the English grasses that were brought in as seed, but it produced results that justified the investment. The climate of the settled districts is temperate, in a way that the word temperate does not quite capture. It is cool and reliable, with rainfall distributed through the year in a pattern that is predictable enough to plan around. The frosts that come in the winter months are real but not severe enough to prevent year-round sheep management. The summers are warm without being hot enough to stress stock. It is, by the standards of the Australian continent, an exceptionally benign climate for pastoral agriculture, and the men who chose to invest in Tasmanian land in the 1820s were choosing well from a purely agricultural perspective, whatever the origins of the capital they were investing. The architectural ambition of those investors is evident in what they built. The stone houses of the Tasmanian colonial period are not the temporary structures of a frontier economy. They are built for permanence, designed to accommodate a way of life that their builders intended to be sustained across generations. The building material, a blue-grey sandstone that is found in quantity in the Hobart area and in the Midlands, is worked with a skill that required craftsmen of considerable ability. Some of those craftsmen were convicts, transported for crimes committed in Britain and assigned to building work in the colony. Their skill is evident in every carefully dressed stone face and precisely fitted joint. The convicts who built these houses brought with them the craft traditions of Britain, and they applied those traditions to the construction of a colonial world that was, in its physical expression, explicitly modelled on the one they had left. The great houses of the Tasmanian colonial period are not numerous by the standards of a well-established European country, but they are concentrated in a way that makes their cultural statement unusually clear. Along the road that runs from Hobart through the Midlands to Launceston, the road that was the spine of the settled colony in the 1820s, you pass within sight of a series of properties that collectively represent the aspirations of the first generation of colonial wealth. Brickenden, Woolmers, Clarendon, Enterley, Panchenga. Each one is substantial. Each one is built of stone. Each one has the proportions and the details of a tradition of architecture that is English in its reference and deliberate in its statement. These houses say, emphatically and without apology, that their owners were not merely farmers or graziers. They were members of a colonial elite that conceived of itself in explicitly aristocratic terms. The deliberateness of that statement is part of what makes the origins of the wealth that funded it so interesting. A man who is simply farming and investing the proceeds does not typically build to this scale in the first decade of his colonial life. A man who has access to capital from the beginning, capital sufficient to fund both the agricultural development and the architectural statement simultaneously, can build at this scale without waiting for the farm to pay for itself. The speed and the scale of the building program in the 1820s and 1830s implies a capital availability that preceded the colonial income, not one that grew gradually from it. The furniture that filled these houses is another dimension of the same story. The imports that came into Hobart Town in the 1820s included not just agricultural supplies, but the material culture of English upper-middle-class life. Furniture made in London and Bristol and Edinburgh, silverware and glassware and ceramics from the potteries of Staffordshire and the workshops of Sheffield, books from the publishers of London, pictures and prints from the dealers of the Strand. The shipping records of the period, incomplete as they are, include references to consignments of this kind, goods ordered and paid for by men who intended to live, in their stone houses at the edge of the world, in a style that their metropolitan contemporaries would have recognized and respected. The cost of importing this material culture to the other side of the world was substantial. The cost of building the houses to receive it was substantial. The cost of the land, the stock, the fencing, the labor management, all of it substantial. The income from wool in the early years of an estate's development, before the flock had built up to its eventual scale and before the quality improvements that came with selective breeding had been fully achieved, was not sufficient to fund all of this simultaneously. Something else had to be providing the foundation, and that something else is what this story keeps coming back to. There is one more thread to pick up before we move deeper into the specific stories of the families involved, and that is the thread of official silence. Not silence in the sense of a deliberate cover-up, though that is possible in some cases, but silence in the sense of the natural tendency of official histories to emphasize what can be clearly documented and to pass lightly over what cannot. The colonial histories of Van Diemen's Land that were written in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were largely written by people who were, in various ways, connected to the colonial establishment that was being described. The descendants of the families whose fortunes were made in the 1820s were prominent citizens of a state that had become self-governing in 1855, and the historians who wrote about those families' ancestors were not, for the most part, inclined to subject the origins of the colonial wealth to the kind of sustained critical scrutiny that might have been uncomfortable. This is not unique to Tasmania. The founding narratives of colonial societies generally elide the more difficult aspects of their formation. The violence of the frontier is minimized or justified or simply omitted. The ambiguous origins of the founding capital are replaced with stories of hard work and enterprise. The coercion that underlay the labor system is reframed as the necessary discipline of a developing society. These narrative choices are understandable in terms of the social function they serve, which is to provide a foundation story that the descendants of the colonial period can be comfortable with. But they have a cost, which is that they obscure the actual complexity of what happened and leave some questions unanswered that deserve to be asked. The question of where the money came from is one of those questions. It is not, ultimately, a question about moral judgment, though moral considerations are inevitably involved in any account of colonial history. It is a question about economic history. It is a question about how capital moves across international networks, how it finds investment opportunities, and how the investment of capital in colonial contexts creates social orders that persist long after the original conditions that produced them have changed. It is a question that has not been asked about Tasmania with the same thoroughness that it has been asked about, say, the plantation economies of the Caribbean or the cotton economy of the American South, where the connections between original capital formation and subsequent social structure have been more fully examined. Tasmania deserves the same examination. Its colonial period is short enough, and its archive is rich enough, that a sustained investigation would likely produce answers to some of the questions this story has been raising. Not complete answers. The gaps in the commercial record are real, and some of them probably cannot be filled. But partial answers, the kind that shift the balance of probability in favor of one explanation over another, are likely attainable. The investigation has not been done with the thoroughness it requires. and that is itself a fact worth noting. Now let's go looking for some of those answers in the specific stories of specific people, because the general argument about the suspicious pace of wealth accumulation in 1820s Tasmania is more compelling and more troubling when it is grounded in the particular details of individual lives. The Archer family of Longford is a good place to start. Thomas Archer arrived in Van Diemen's Land in 1821. He came from Scotland, from a family that had modest commercial interests in the textile trade. He brought with him, according to the official accounts, a modest amount of capital, enough to purchase a small initial landholding and to begin establishing a flock. Within 10 years, the Archer family had one of the largest pastoral operations in the Northern Midlands. Brickenden and Woolmers, the two properties that became the centres of the Archer family's estate, represent an investment in land, buildings, and stock that is difficult to reconcile with the rate of return that the documented pastoral activities of the property could have produced in the time available. The Archers have been the subject of historical attention partly because Brickenden and Woolmers were, in later life, acquired by the Tasmanian government and turned into heritage properties. Their records are accordingly better preserved than those of many comparable estates. And those records, while they paint a picture of a successful and industrious family, do not quite add up. The expenditures on construction and improvement in the 1820s and early 1830s are larger than the income from wool and cattle that the property accounts record for the same period. The difference has to come from somewhere, and the obvious explanation that Thomas Archer brought more capital with him than the official account suggests, or that capital was coming into the property from sources not reflected in the property accounts, is one that the family history does not address. The Archer family's connections in Scotland before emigration are not fully documented. The textile trade background is a plausible cover for connections to the capital markets of Glasgow and Edinburgh, both of which were, in the early 19th century, heavily involved in financing colonial ventures of various kinds. Whether those connections brought Archer to Tasmania with capital of genuinely commercial origin, or whether some of that capital had more complex roots in the networks of maritime commerce and colonial trade that connected Scotland to the wider British Empire, is not something the surviving records make clear. There is another dimension to the Archer story that is worth noting. Thomas Archer arrived in 1821, which is early in the period of significant free settler immigration to the colony. He arrived with a clear sense of where he wanted to go and what he wanted to do. He chose the Northern Midlands specifically, a region that was, at the time, in the process of being opened up by the colonial administration through the extension of the road network and the increase in land grants. His choice of location was astute, suggesting either familiarity with the colony that preceded his official arrival or access to unusually good intelligence about the colony's developmental trajectory. The Northern Midlands proved in the following decades to be among the most productive pastoral land in the colony. The man who chose to invest there in 1821 was either very well informed or very lucky. And in colonial history, very well informed and very lucky tend to mean the same thing. The Kermode family at Mona Vale offers a different but related story. William Kermode arrived in the colony in 1821, the same year as Archer, which is itself interesting. A cluster of men who would become the significant pastoralists of the colonial period arrived in the same year, suggesting either a common information source that recommended 1821 as the right moment to invest in Van Diemen's Land, or a common push factor that made departure from Britain attractive at that particular time. Kermode was Manx, from the Isle of Man, which is a detail that might seem insignificant but is actually relevant because the Isle of Man had, in the early 19th century, a particular relationship to the financial networks of the British Isles. The Isle of Man was not simply a geographical oddity between England and Ireland. It was, by the early 19th century, a well-established base for financial activities that were legally ambiguous in the broader British context. Smuggling, which the island had practiced on a large scale throughout the 18th century, was being supplemented by other forms of financial service that exploited the island's unusual legal status. The management of capital in ways that avoided the full weight of British taxation and regulation was one of those services. The connection between the Isle of Man and the less visible end of British commercial life was real and well established by the time Kermode left for Van Diemen's Land. None of this proves that Kermode's capital had problematic origins. The Isle of Man connection explains the financial opacity, not the specific nature of the capital. But it adds to the picture of an early colonial society in Van Diemen's Land, in which the financial backgrounds of the major settlers were, in various ways, connected to the more opaque end of British commercial life. Mona Vale, the property that Kermode built in the Ross area of the Midlands, is one of the most significant surviving colonial houses in Tasmania. It is a formal Georgian structure of considerable ambition, built in the 1820s and expanded in subsequent decades. The property around it was developed into a substantial pastoral estate, with a speed that is consistent with the pattern we have been examining. Initial rapid development of the property over the following decade. A level of architectural investment that implies capital availability beyond what the pastoral income of the first years could have provided. The Ross area itself is worth noting because it was the site of one of the most significant infrastructure investments of the colonial period in Van Diemen's Land. The Ross Bridge, built by convict labour in the late 1820s, is one of the most celebrated examples of convict craftsmanship in Australia. Its stone ornamentation, the work of a convict stonemason of remarkable skill. The bridge was necessary because the Midland Road crossed the Macquarie River at that point, and a ford that was passable in dry weather became impassable in floods. The colonial administration's decision to build a substantial stone bridge at Ross in the late 1820s reflected the importance of the Midlands route to the economy of the settled districts and the investment that the major Ross pastoral families of the area had made in the development of that economy. Those families were not passive beneficiaries of the government's infrastructure investment. They lobbied for it, they supported the administrators who authorized it, and they used their positions as magistrates and as members of the colonial council to ensure that the resources of the colonial government were directed toward the development of the settled districts in ways that served their interests. The relationship between the major pastoral families and the colonial administration was not an adversarial one. It was a collaborative one, in which the administration provided land, labor, and infrastructure, and the pastoralists provided the agricultural and commercial activity that justified the administration's existence and generated the tax revenue that funded its operations. This collaboration was managed through personal relationships of a kind that the formal administrative record does not always capture clearly. The men who built the Tasmanian colonial establishment knew each other socially. They worshipped in the same churches. They dined in each other's houses. They formed the juries that adjudicated disputes and the benches that heard criminal cases. Their collective management of the colony was, in practice, the management of a community that was small enough and interconnected enough to operate largely through informal channels. George Arthur sat at the center of this web. His tenure as Lieutenant Governor from 1824 to 1836 overlapped almost exactly with the period in which the major pastoral fortunes were being assembled. His administration of the colony was not corrupt in the straightforward sense of selling offices or accepting bribes, but it was managed in ways that consistently benefited the men who were part of the inner circle of the colonial establishment, and the land grant system through which that establishment was built was administered in ways that concentrated resources in the hands of a relatively small group. Arthur's own subsequent career is relevant here. He left Van Diemen's Land in 1836 and went on to serve as Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, where he managed another colonial frontier with the same combination of administrative efficiency and preferential treatment for the established families that had characterized his Tasmanian period. He was created a baronet in 1841, a formal recognition of his services to the British Empire. He died in 1854 as Lieutenant General Sir George Arthur, a figure whose career embodied the possibilities of colonial administration for men of energy and ambition, and a certain flexibility about the distinction between public duty and private advantage. The men who built the Tasmanian fortunes in his time were, in various ways, his collaborators. Their success depended on his management of the land grant system, his administration of the convict assignment process, and his maintenance of a colonial order that protected their property and facilitated their commerce. In return, they provided him with the social and political foundation from which he governed. It was a relationship that worked well for everyone involved, and it was a relationship whose character is visible in the patterns of land grant distribution, convict assignment, and commercial advantage that the records of his administration preserve. What the records do not preserve, for the most part, is the prior history of these collaborators. They arrived in the colony and they built their estates, and they embedded themselves in the colonial establishment, and the colonial records track that process with considerable fidelity. But the stories they brought with them from the other side of the world, the stories of how they had come to have the capital to invest in the colony, and the connections to each other that made their investment so effectively coordinated, those stories are only partially told in what survives. The partial telling has served them well, in the sense that it has created a history that is respectable and comprehensible, and that provides a foundation story for their descendants that emphasizes enterprise and vision and perseverance. That foundation story is not false. Exactly. The enterprise and vision and perseverance were real. The wool was real. The stone houses were real. The agricultural development was real. But the foundation story is incomplete, and the incompleteness is not accidental. The incomplete foundation story matters because it has shaped the subsequent historical literature in ways that compound the original omission. When later historians approached the question of Tasmanian colonial wealth, they did so largely in the context provided by the existing narrative. The existing narrative said that the wealth came from wool and land development and the intelligent application of colonial opportunities. Later historians, working with the same fragmentary commercial records and the same tendency to take the colonial administration's own accounts at face value, tended to confirm rather than challenge that narrative. The result is a historiography that is internally consistent and externally unconvincing, a story that explains everything except the most important things. The most important things are the pace of the wealth accumulation and the prior connections of the families involved. Everything else, the wool industry, the land grants, the convict labor, the pastoral development, is real and documented and genuinely significant. But those elements, by themselves, do not account for what was built in the 1820s and 1830s. They account for the superstructure. The foundations remain obscure. Let's push a little deeper into the maritime dimension, because it is there, in the intersection of the legitimate and illegitimate economies of the early 19th century Southern Ocean, that some of the most interesting material is to be found. The sealers of the Bay Strait were not, as I mentioned earlier, primarily Tasmanians. They were a mixed group drawn from across the maritime world, including a significant number of Americans, particularly from the sealing ports of New England. The American sealing industry had been active in the Southern Ocean since the 1790s, and by the 1820s, American vessels were a regular presence in Bass Strait and in the waters around Tasmania. The relationship between these American operators and the established Tasmanian commercial community was not simply that of foreign vessels using the port. Some of the American operators had established longer-term commercial relationships with Tasmanian merchant houses, relationships that went beyond the simple purchase of provisions and repair services. The American connection in early Tasmanian history is one of those threads that has been noted but not fully followed. The records of American shipping in the region are preserved partly in Tasmanian archives and partly in American ones, particularly in the records of the sealing and whaling industries that are held in New Bedford and Nantucket and other New England ports. A comparison of those American records with the Tasmanian ones produces some interesting discrepancies, particularly in relation to cargo descriptions and port of call records, discrepancies that suggest the American vessels were not always representing their activities in the same way to different authorities. This is not surprising given the commercial environment of the time. The complex network of maritime trade in the Pacific in the 1820s included multiple national interests and jurisdictions that were often in tension, and operators who could navigate those tensions by presenting different faces to different authorities were commercially advantaged. But the discrepancies are worth noting because they suggest that the commercial activity connecting Van Diemen's Land to the wider Pacific was more complex and less fully documented than the official record implies. The American whalers who used Hobart as a base are a slightly different case from the sealers, but an equally interesting one. The American whaling industry in the first half of the 19th century was the largest maritime industry in the world by some measures, and its operations in the Pacific constituted a network of commercial relationships that extended across thousands of miles of ocean. The whaling captains who called at Hobart were connected to merchant houses in New Bedford and Providence and New York that were in turn connected to the larger networks of American and international commerce. The provision of stores and repairs to those captains was a lucrative business for the Tasmanian merchants who competed for it, and the relationships that developed in the context of that commerce extended beyond the simple transaction of goods for money. Some of those relationships appear to have extended to the movement of goods other than whale oil and sperm oil and the standard provisions of a whaling voyage. The specific nature of those goods is difficult to document, precisely because the documentation of the trade was managed in ways that obscured its full content. But the circumstantial evidence, including the involvement of some Tasmanian merchants in commercial operations that seem, from the surviving records, disproportionately profitable relative to their apparent scale, suggests that the whaling connection was one avenue through which value was moved into the Tasmanian economy, in ways that do not appear clearly in the official trade statistics. There is one specific case that deserves extended attention because it illustrates the possibilities more clearly than the general argument can do. The firm of Birch and Company, which operated in Hobart Town from the early 1820s and which was associated with the family connections already mentioned in relation to Alexander Birch, was involved in the whaling supply trade and also in a range of other commercial activities that included land development and convict assignment management. The firm's accounts, to the extent that they survive, show a pattern of income that is difficult to reconcile entirely with the documented scale of its operations in the legitimate commerce of the colony. The Birch connection to the wider colonial world is particularly interesting. Alexander Birch had been in New South Wales before moving to Van Diemen's Land, and his connections there included men who were involved in the more complex commercial operations of the Sydney merchant community. The Sydney of the 1820s was itself a place where the distinction between legitimate and semi-legitimate commerce was not always clearly drawn, and the operators who could move between the two spheres successfully were among the most prosperous members of the colonial business community. Some of that prosperity appears to have been channeled, through the Birch connection, into the Tasmanian commercial scene. The pattern of capital movement between the established colony of New South Wales and the newer colony of Van Diemen's Land is itself an underexplored dimension of the story. Money that had been accumulated in New South Wales through the complex commercial operations of the early colonial period found new investment opportunities in Van Diemen's Land as the land grant system opened up productive pastoral country in the 1820s. The men who moved that capital were not always the same men who put it to work in the new colony, but they were connected through the social and commercial networks of the colonial world in ways that the official records partially preserve. John Dunn, who arrived in Van Diemen's Land in the mid-1820s and who established himself in the settled districts with a speed that is consistent with the pattern we have been examining, had prior connections in New South Wales that are only partially documented. His property in the Midlands was acquired and developed with a rapidity that implies significant initial capital, and his subsequent commercial activities, which extended into the livestock trade and eventually into banking, suggest a financial sophistication that is not fully explained by his documented background. The early banking history of Van Diemen's Land is itself a significant dimension of this story. The Bank of Van Diemen's Land, established in 1823, was the first bank in the colony, and its establishment represented a significant institutional step in the development of the colonial economy. The men who founded it and who sat on its first board were drawn from the emerging colonial establishment, the same network of pastoralists and merchants and government officials that was assembling the colonial fortunes. The bank's early operations included the provision of credit to its founders and their associates, credit that facilitated the continued expansion of the pastoral estates and the commercial operations associated with them. The connection between colonial banking and colonial wealth accumulation is a general phenomenon in the history of settler societies, but in Van Diemen's Land it had a particular character, because the bank's establishment came at exactly the moment when the first generation of pastoral fortunes was being built. The credit that the bank provided allowed men who already had substantial capital to leverage it further, accelerating the process of estate development and commercial expansion. And the bank's management of deposits and loans created, for the first time in the colony, a formal institutional record of capital movements that had previously existed only in private correspondence and account books. That institutional record is, paradoxically, one of the places where the ambiguity of the colonial capital is most clearly visible. The bank's early loan records, which survive in partial form in Tasmanian archives, show patterns of credit extension that are consistent with the picture of an economy in which substantial capital was already available from non-banking sources, with the bank's credit being used to extend and leverage that capital rather than to substitute for it. Men who already had adequate capital to fund their pastoral operations were borrowing additional funds from the bank, not because they needed the money for their farms, but because the borrowed money could be put to work in additional commercial activities that amplified the returns on the original capital. This pattern of financial sophistication in a colony that had existed for barely 20 years is itself an indication that the men running the early Tasmanian economy were not simple farmers applying colonial opportunities. They were men who understood capital and credit and leverage and investment in ways that reflected experience with financial markets of some kind. Experience that their documented backgrounds in English or Scottish or Irish commerce do not always fully account for. The question keeps coming back to what that experience was and where it came from. The most conservative answer is that some of these men had more sophisticated commercial backgrounds than their official biographies suggest, that the modest family businesses and minor colonial connections recorded in their arrival documents understated the actual extent of their commercial experience and their financial networks. The more interesting answer is that some of the experience was gained in contexts that could not be openly acknowledged, in the commercial networks of the colonial Pacific, in the semi-legitimate trading operations that connected the Southern Ocean to the markets of Asia and South America, in the complex financial arrangements that moved capital across imperial boundaries in ways that formal regulatory frameworks were not designed to accommodate. Both answers are probably partly true. The early Tasmanian colonial establishment was not a homogeneous group, and the origins of its constituent members' capital were not uniform. What they shared was the destination. Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s was a place where capital could be profitably invested, where the investment could be clearly documented as legitimate pastoral and commercial activity, and where the distance from London made the detailed examination of the capital's origins practically difficult. The language of frontier opportunity that the colonial historians have used to describe this period is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The opportunity was real, but the men who were positioned to exploit it had, in many cases, been positioned by prior access to capital and prior commercial networks that the frontier opportunity narrative does not fully explain. The frontier rewarded enterprise and vision, but it rewarded most of all those who arrived already equipped with the financial and social resources to exploit it efficiently. And the men who arrived in Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s with that equipment were not, in most cases, the beneficiaries of simple good fortune or exceptional personal industry. Something had given them the equipment before they arrived. That something, this story has been arguing, was at least partly the complex and partially opaque commercial world of the early 19th century British Empire, in which capital moved through networks that were not always clearly documented, in which the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate commerce was less clearly drawn than subsequent historical accounts have preferred to imagine, and in which the colonial frontier provided exactly the investment opportunity that mobile capital was looking for. The consequences of that investment have been with Tasmania ever since. The social order that the 1820s fortunes created was durable in ways that reflected the deliberateness of its construction. The families that built it did not simply accumulate wealth, they built institutions. They built churches, as we have noted. They built schools. They built the informal networks of social obligation and preferential connection that are the real substance of a ruling class. They invested in the colonial political structures that protected their economic interests. And they married carefully, preserving the networks and the capital across generations. By the 1850s, when Van Diemen's Land renamed itself Tasmania and moved towards self-government, the colonial establishment was a fixed feature of the social landscape. The wool fortunes of the 1820s had by then been supplemented by the mining industry, which began to develop in the island's west and northwest from the 1870s onward. But the pastoral families retained their social and political prominence, even as the economic center of gravity shifted, and the networks they had built in the 1820s and 1830s remained the infrastructure through which Tasmanian society organized itself. The institutional legacy of the 1820s fortunes is visible in Tasmania today in ways that are simultaneously obvious and unremarked upon. The Anglican churches of the Midlands, built in the early colonial period with the patronage of the major pastoral families, are still standing and still in use. The properties themselves, those that survived the economic vicissitudes of the subsequent century, are now heritage sites that receive considerable attention from the tourist industry. Brickenden and Woolmers, which we have already discussed, are World Heritage listed as part of the Australian convict sites, a designation that focuses attention on the convict labour that built them rather than on the capital that directed that labour. The World Heritage designation is, in its way, another version of the incomplete narrative. It acknowledges the contribution of convict labour to the built heritage of Tasmania, which is appropriate and important. But it does not ask where the owners of those properties got the money to direct the convict labour, and it does not examine the other conditions, the dispossession of the Aboriginal population, the commercial networks of the early colonial world, that made the properties possible. The heritage narrative, like the colonial historical narrative before it, emphasizes what can be clearly seen and passes lightly over what requires excavation to understand. The excavation is worth doing, not because the result will be a simple story of villains exposed, but because the result will be a more complete understanding of how colonial wealth was assembled and how it shaped the societies that it funded. Tasmania is a small case, but it is a well-documented one by colonial standards, and the questions it raises about the relationship between capital formation, colonial expansion, labour coercion, and indigenous dispossession are questions that apply across the colonial world. They are also questions that are increasingly being asked in various colonial contexts by historians who are less willing than their predecessors to take the official narrative of colonial enterprise at face value. The examination of the origins of colonial wealth, the work of tracing capital back through the networks that generated it, is a growing area of historical research that has produced significant revisions to received histories in the Caribbean context, in the South African context, and in the context of North American settlement. Tasmania has not yet received the same treatment, but the material is there for the investigation. That investigation would begin, necessarily, with the shipping records. Not just the records preserved in Tasmanian archives, but the records in British archives, in American archives, in the archives of India and South Africa and South America, that would allow the maritime networks of the 1820s to be reconstructed in greater detail. It would proceed through the commercial records of the major pastoral families, comparing the documented income from legitimate pastoral activity with the documented expenditure on land and buildings and stock and imports. It would examine the banking records of the Bank of Van Diemen's Land and its successors for patterns of capital movement that reveal the underlying financial structure of the colonial economy. and it would engage with the archives of the Van Diemen's Land Company, which have never been fully analyzed, in a sustained attempt to understand what the company was actually doing in the years when it was, by its own accounts, commercially unsuccessful. The result would not be a definitive account. The gaps in the record are too significant for that. But it would be a more honest account, one that acknowledged what is not known as well as what is, and that drew the proper conclusions from the pattern of evidence that does survive. A pattern that consistently points toward the conclusion that the wealth of 1820s Tasmania was assembled from sources and through processes that the official record only partially reflects. The families that built that wealth are still part of Tasmania's social fabric, in various degrees. Some of the direct descendants of the major colonial families are still prominent. Others have dispersed, moved to the mainland or to other parts of the world. Their Tasmanian origins a matter of family history rather than current identity. The properties that bore their names have, in many cases, passed out of family hands, either through sale or through the various mechanisms of historical change that have reshaped land ownership across the Western world since the 19th century. But the social and institutional structures they created have proved more durable than the family names attached to them. The Anglican churches of the Midlands still serve communities whose social character was shaped by the colonial period. The schools that the colonial establishment patronized have continued in various forms. The pastoral industry that was the foundation of the colonial economy is still a significant part of Tasmanian economic life, though its scale and character have changed enormously since the 1820s. The political culture of Tasmania retains, in various ways, the imprint of the colonial period's concentration of power in relatively few hands. These continuities are worth noting because they are the contemporary manifestation of decisions made in the 1820s, decisions about where to invest capital and how to organize labor, and how to manage the relationship between private interest and public authority. Those decisions were made by people whose full story has not been told, and the telling of that story is, among other things, a contribution to understanding how the contemporary world came to be the way it is. The money that came from somewhere in the early 1820s and funded the construction of stone houses on a small island at the bottom of the world is not just a historical curiosity. It is the foundation of a social order that has been in place for 200 years. An order whose origins deserve to be understood as clearly as possible, not to condemn the people who created it, but to understand the full range of conditions that made it possible. That understanding is what this story has been attempting to provide, imperfectly and with the necessary acknowledgement of what remains unknown. The thread has led through the maritime history of the early 19th century Pacific, through the commercial networks of the colonial world, through the administrative arrangements of a small penal colony at the edge of the known world, and through the lives of men whose backgrounds are only partially documented. What it has found is not a simple answer, but a more complex question. A question about the relationship between capital and power, and violence, and the stories we tell about ourselves in retrospect. The stone houses of the Tasmanian Midlands are very beautiful. They stand in landscapes that are, on a clear southern day, genuinely extraordinary. The pale light of the Antipodean sky over hills that have the quiet assurance of country that has been managed for a long time. They carry in their careful stonework the skill of men who built them under compulsion, and they embody in their proportions and their details the aspirations of men who came to the edge of the world and proceeded to build the only version of civilization they knew. The aspirations were real. The skill was real. The civilization that resulted was real, with all the complexity and ambiguity that the word real implies. And somewhere in the story of how it came to be built, in the spaces between what the records say and what they imply, in the gaps between documented income and documented expenditure, in the maritime networks and the colonial commercial webs and the Pacific disruptions of the early 19th century, is the part of the story that has not been fully told. It is still there, waiting for someone to go looking for it. Not in the stone houses themselves, which have been examined and photographed and heritage listed and written about at length, but in the archives, in the shipping records and the banking ledgers and the commercial correspondence and the colonial official papers, in the comparative analysis of what different archives in different countries preserve about the same events. The trail is cold, as all historical trails eventually become, but it has not gone cold enough to be unreadable. Someone should read it. Let's follow a different thread now, one that leads away from the commercial and toward the political, because the story of the 1820s Tasmanian fortunes is inseparable from the story of colonial governance, and the story of colonial governance in Van Diemen's Land is itself a story of remarkable concentration of power in remarkably few hands. The constitutional structure of Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s was, by any measure, an autocratic one. The Lieutenant Governor held executive authority that was subject to oversight by the Colonial Office in London, but the practical limits of that oversight, given the communication delays we have already discussed, meant that the Lieutenant Governor had enormous discretion in the day-to-day management of the colony. There was a nominated legislative council from 1,825, but its members were appointed by the governor and served at his pleasure, which meant that it functioned more as an advisory body than as a genuine check on executive power. This concentration of formal authority was, in the Tasmanian context, significantly amplified by the informal authority of the major colonial families. A small community in which the same men sat on the Legislative Council, served as magistrates, managed the assignment of convict labor, sat on the boards of the Colonial Bank, and worshipped in the same churches was not a community in which formal and informal power were clearly separated. The formal institutions of colonial governance operated within a social context that was shaped and directed by the networks of personal connection and economic interest that tied the major families to each other and to the administration. Arthur understood this, and he managed it with considerable skill. His administration was not simply a tool of the colonial elite. He maintained his independence from any individual family or faction, and he was willing to act against particular interests when doing so served the larger purposes of colonial order. But his management of the overall system was one that worked consistently with the direction of concentrating power and resources in the hands of a manageable group of settlers whose economic interests were aligned with the maintenance of the existing order. The land grant system, the convict assignment system, the control of commerce through the colonial administration's oversight of imports and exports. All of these were managed in ways that consistently benefited the established families and consistently disadvantaged new arrivals and smaller operators who lacked the connections to access the system's resources. The political economy of Arthur's Van Diemen's Land was, in effect, a managed oligarchy. The management was sophisticated, and the oligarchs were a group rather than a single family, which gave the system a degree of resilience that a simple dynastic arrangement would not have had. But the concentration of economic and political power was real and deliberate, and it had consequences that persisted long after Arthur himself had left the colony. The most significant of those consequences was the development of a class structure in Tasmania that was, by the standards of colonial Australia, unusually rigid. The mainland colonies, particularly after the gold rushes of the 1850s, became societies in which the social hierarchy was genuinely more fluid, in which new wealth could more easily translate into social position and political influence. Tasmania retained, longer than the mainland, the social character of a society in which the established families held a disproportionate share of economic and political power, and in which that power was defended through the institutional arrangements that the original colonial establishment had created. This social rigidity has often been attributed to the penal character of the colony, to the stigma that transportation attached to the island and that made free settlers reluctant to settle there in large numbers after the gold rushes drew migration to the mainland. That explanation is not wrong. The penal stigma was real, and it did affect Tasmania's development trajectory. But it is a partial explanation, because the rigidity of Tasmanian society was established before the penal character of the island became the decisive obstacle to immigration. It was established in the 1820s, when the major pastoral families consolidated their position in ways that made the subsequent social history of the colony a function of choices made in those early years. The men who made those choices were operating in a colonial frontier environment, with all the ambiguity and opportunity that such an environment provides. They were also, as this story has argued, operating with capital and connections that gave them advantages that the official narrative of colonial enterprise does not fully acknowledge. The result was a colonial society that was built on foundations whose full character has never been completely examined, and whose durability across 2 centuries reflects the effectiveness with which those foundations were laid. There is a particular kind of historical neglect that attaches to places and periods that are, by the standards of larger historical stories, relatively minor. Tasmania in the 1820s was minor by those standards. It was a small colony on a small island, overshadowed by the larger developments of the mainland, operating at the margins of the British imperial enterprise. Its story has been told in ways that are proportional to its apparent significance, which is to say, in abbreviated ways that emphasize the interesting details and pass over the complex ones. The abbreviated story is not satisfying, not because it is false, but because it is incomplete in the specific ways that matter most for understanding how colonial wealth was assembled and how colonial societies were organized. The full story, or as much of it as the surviving evidence allows, is more interesting and more instructive. And it begins with the recognition that the wealth of 1820s Tasmania did not appear from nowhere, even if its origins are not always clearly visible in the places where the official history has been taught to look. It appeared from the commercial world of the early 19th century British Empire, a world that was more complex, more opaque, and more connected to the ambiguous commercial operations of the colonial Pacific than the conventional histories of Australian settlement have generally acknowledged. It appeared in the stone houses and the pastoral estates and the fine wool and the colonial institutions of a small island at the bottom of the world. And it created a social order whose durability is, in the end, the most eloquent testimony to the effectiveness of what was built in those years when the records were being kept incompletely and the questions were not yet being asked. The questions deserve to be asked now, not with the expectation of simple answers, but with the commitment to follow the evidence wherever it leads, through the shipping records, and the banking ledgers, and the commercial correspondence, and the colonial official papers, and through the comparative analysis that places the Tasmanian story in its proper context within the wider history of colonial capital formation. That wider history is the context in which the Tasmanian case makes most sense. The specific details of the Van Diemen's Land fortunes are interesting in themselves, but they are most interesting as a local example of a global phenomenon, the movement of capital from the complex commercial world of the early 19th century into the investment opportunities provided by colonial expansion through processes that were not always transparent, and that created social orders whose foundations are less solidly built on the enterprise and vision of their founders than the official histories have suggested. Tasmania is one window into that phenomenon. It is a small window, but it opens onto a view that extends much further than the island itself, out into the Pacific commerce of the early 19th century, back into the financial dislocations of the Napoleonic Wars, across to the commercial networks of India and South America, and forward into the social and institutional history of a place that is still, in various ways, living with the consequences of what was built there 200 years ago. The window has been partly obscured by the patina of heritage and the soft light of historical distance. It deserves to be cleaned. The Aboriginal dimension of this story demands more sustained attention than it has received so far, because it is not a separate thread but the same thread, running through the center of the story of colonial wealth and emerging, unavoidably, as the condition on which everything else depended. The Palawa people of Van Diemen's Land were not, in the 1820s, a population in terminal decline. They were a population under extreme pressure from the expanding colonial settlements, but they were still present, still organized in the clan and language group structures that had sustained them for tens of thousands of years, still capable of resistance to the encroachments on their country. The resistance took the form of what the colonial records call raids on settler properties, the killing of stock and sometimes of settlers who were operating in the zone between the established settlements and the unceded Aboriginal country beyond them. That resistance was, from the Palawa perspective, a rational response to the occupation of their land and the destruction of the food resources on which their economy depended. The kangaroos and wallabies that the colonial sheep and cattle had displaced were not simply a food source. They were the material basis of a complex economic and cultural system that had operated successfully in the Tasmanian environment for the entirety of human occupation of the island. The displacement of that system by the colonial pastoral economy was not an accidental consequence of innocent enterprise. It was the direct result of decisions made by the colonial administration and the pastoral families to expand settlement into country that was already occupied and used. The conflict that resulted from that expansion reached its most intense phase in the late 1820s, exactly the period when the major pastoral fortunes were being assembled and the major pastoral estates were being established. The geographical overlap between the areas of most intense pastoral development and the areas of most intense frontier conflict is not coincidental. The most productive pastoral land in the colony was also the most intensively used Aboriginal land, because the Aboriginal land management practices that had created the open grasslands were precisely the practices that had made those areas attractive for pastoral purposes. The major pastoral families were therefore directly implicated in the conditions that produced the Black War, not as individuals who committed specific acts of violence, though some of them did, but as participants in a system of colonial expansion that created the conflict. The convicts who cleared the land and built the fences and drove the stock were doing work that dispossessed the Palawa as effectively as any direct act of violence. The government that issued the land grants and organized the convict labor assignments was creating the conditions of the conflict through its policies, even when it occasionally deplored the violence that resulted. George Arthur's response to the conflict was characteristic of the man. He organized the famous Black Line of 1830, in which virtually the entire non-Aboriginal population of the settled districts, including convicts and free settlers, formed a line stretching across the settled areas and attempted to drive the remaining Palawa population of the settled districts onto the Tasman Peninsula. The Black Line was, in operational terms, largely unsuccessful. Most of the Palawa evaded it, but it demonstrated the colonial administration's willingness to mobilize the entire population of the colony in the service of clearing the settled areas of their original inhabitants. The subsequent fate of the Palawa is one of the most often cited examples of colonial genocide in Australian history, though the terminology continues to be debated. The surviving Aboriginal population, after the failure of the Black Line, was persuaded by the missionary George Augustus Robinson to surrender and accept removal to Flinders Island, where they were resettled in conditions that proved fatal to most of them. The population that had numbered in the thousands at the beginning of the colonial period had been reduced by the mid-1840s to a few dozen individuals. The last person who is known to have been born of fully Palawa parents died in 1876. The rapid disappearance of the Palawa people is sometimes presented in historical accounts as a consequence of disease and cultural disruption rather than deliberate policy. That framing, while not entirely wrong, understates the degree to which the conditions that produced the demographic catastrophe were the deliberate creation of colonial policy. The removal to Flinders Island, which was one of the direct causes of the population decline, was organized by the colonial administration and carried out with the agreement of the major pastoral families who stood to benefit from the final clearing of the settled districts. The benefit was not incidental. The removal of the Palawa from the settled areas eliminated the last significant source of resistance to the expansion of the pastoral estates. The violence of the frontier had already constrained that expansion in ways that were economically costly, both through the direct losses of stock and occasionally of settler lives, and through the need to maintain vigilance that disrupted the normal operations of the pastoral economy. The removal resolved those costs by removing the people who were the source of them. The pastoral fortunes of the 1820s were therefore built not just on colonial labor and maritime commerce and ambiguous capital, but on the specific and deliberate elimination of the people who had prior claim to the land on which those fortunes were invested. This dimension of the story is the most uncomfortable, and it is also the most clearly documented, which perhaps explains why it has been addressed separately from the commercial history rather than integrated with it. The comfortable narrative of colonial enterprise and the uncomfortable narrative of colonial violence have been kept in separate compartments by a historiographical convention that reflects the discomfort of their integration. They are not separate, they are the same story. The capital that funded the pastoral estates and the violence that cleared the land for those estates were components of a single process of colonial accumulation, in which the specific form of the Tasmanian case reflects the particular plastation's conditions of a small island with a small Aboriginal population, and a colonial administration willing to commit the full resources of the colonial state to the project of clearing and developing the settled areas. The integration of these dimensions of the story does not simplify it. It makes it more complex and more disturbing. The men who built the Tasmanian fortunes were not simply entrepreneurs exploiting colonial opportunity. They were participants in a system that included the coerced labor of transported convicts, the violent dispossession of the Aboriginal population, and the investment of capital whose origins were not always as clean as the pastoral mythology of colonial Australia has preferred to imagine. All three of those dimensions contributed to the wealth that was assembled in the 1820s. And all three of them have consequences that are still visible in the contemporary world. The heritage tourism industry that now operates around the surviving colonial properties is one manifestation of those consequences. The continued marginalization of Aboriginal Tasmanians, many of whom are descended from Palawa ancestors who survived the colonial period, is another. The social and institutional structures of Tasmanian society, which retain certain features of the oligarchic organization of the colonial establishment, are a third. None of these contemporary manifestations can be fully understood without engaging with the full story of how they came to be, a story that includes the origins of the colonial wealth, the mechanisms of the labor system, the process of Aboriginal dispossession, and the networks of commercial and political power through which all of these were managed. The telling of that full story is the project that this account has been attempting to advance, incompletely and with the necessary acknowledgement of what remains uncertain. What is certain is that the official story, the story of colonial enterprise and pastoral vision, and the emergence of wealth through honest agricultural labor, is incomplete in ways that matter. The incompleteness has persisted for 200 years, and it has served the purposes of the people who benefit from the incomplete version. That is, in the end, the strongest argument for pursuing the complete one. The money came from somewhere. The land was cleared by someone. The labor was supplied by people who had no choice in the matter. And the people who had lived on the land for 35,000 years were removed from it by organized violence and calculated neglect. The stone houses that resulted from all of this are very beautiful. They deserve to be understood for what they are, which is monuments to all of the above. Let's take a specific journey now through the landscape of the Tasmanian Midlands as it existed in the 1820s and 1830s, because there is something in the physical experience of this country that helps to anchor the historical argument in a way that abstract analysis cannot quite achieve. Imagine setting out from Hobart Town in 1825, heading north on the main road that connected the colonial capital to Launceston and the northern settlements. The town itself, by 1825, was already more substantial than its age might suggest. There were brick and stone buildings along the main streets, warehouses near the wharf, the beginnings of the institutional architecture that colonial society required, government buildings, a courthouse, churches beginning to rise on their lots. The harbour was busy with the shipping that we have already discussed, vessels of various nationalities and purposes, moving in and out of the Derwent estuary, with a regularity that would have surprised the earliest inhabitants of the settlement. Heading north from Hobart, you climbed through the settled fringe of the Derwent Valley and began crossing the tablelands that would eventually open into the Midlands proper. The landscape you passed through was in various stages of transformation. In the areas closest to Hobart, the land had been cleared and improved, with English grasses establishing themselves in the paddocks that had been fenced with split timber rails and the substantial wooden posts that convict labour had installed across the previous decade. Flocks of merino sheep grazed in a landscape that had, within living memory, been native grassland and open woodland, maintained by the Palawa through their burning practices. Further north, the transformation was less complete. You passed through zones where the clearing was recent and the fencing newly installed, where the native grasses still dominated and the pasture improvement was still in progress. In these zones, the evidence of the frontier was more apparent. The signs of conflict and the precautions that settlers maintained against it, the lookout positions at the high points of the road, the arrangements for rapid communication between properties in the event of trouble. The properties themselves, as you traveled north, ranged from the simple and functional to the increasingly ambitious. The earliest settler establishments were modest affairs, timber buildings in cleared patches of land with stockyards and outbuildings that reflected the priorities of a working farm rather than the aspirations of a colonial establishment. But as you moved through the period of the 1820s development and encountered the properties built by the major families, the scale and ambition of the architecture increased dramatically. Panchanga, in the Longford area, was being built from the mid-1820s and represented an early example of the stone country house tradition that would define the architectural character of the Midlands. Its design reflected the Georgian vernacular of English rural architecture, adapted for colonial conditions in ways that were sensible and that preserved the essential character of the tradition. The stone used was the local sandstone, but it was dressed and fitted by craftsmen, many of them convicts with trades that had been practiced in Britain, who brought to it a quality of workmanship that the informal character of colonial construction would not usually have produced. The properties north of Longford, in the area around Westbury and Deloraine, were somewhat less developed in the mid-1820s, but were in the process of rapid development as the land grants of Arthur's administration opened up new areas for pastoral activity. The families that were establishing themselves in this zone were, in many cases, the same families who had connections to the Hobart merchant community and to the maritime networks that we have been discussing. Their choice of the Northern Midlands and the Tamar Valley reflected both the agricultural quality of the land and the access to the northern port of Launceston, which offered an alternative shipping route to Hobart and connections to the Bass Strait trade that had particular significance for certain kinds of commerce. Launceston itself, in the 1820s, was a smaller and less developed town than Hobart, but it was growing rapidly. Its position at the head of the Tamar estuary made it a natural commercial center for the northern settlements, and the commercial community that was developing there had connections to the Bass Strait sealing and trading operations that were, as we have noted, one of the more opaque dimensions of the colonial economy. The merchants of Launceston, who supplied the sealing vessels and handled their produce, occupied a position of commercial advantage that was somewhat different from that of the Hobart merchant community, reflecting the different character of the maritime activity in the north. The road between Hobart and Launceston that was being improved through the 1820s was itself a product of the pastoral development it facilitated. The need to move wool from the Midlands farms to the ports required a road that could handle the drays and carts that carried the wool bales, and the improvement of the road was a continuing project of convict labor that reflected the colonial administration's commitment to facilitating the development of the pastoral economy. The Ross Bridge, which we have already mentioned, was the most significant single structure on this road, and its construction in the late 1820s marked a significant moment in the development of the Midlands as a productive agricultural zone. The journey from Hobart to Launceston in the 1820s, which took several days by road and required overnight stops at the stations that were developing along the route, was therefore a journey through a landscape in rapid transformation, a landscape in which the marks of the colonial enterprise, the fences, the cleared paddocks, the stone buildings, the improving road, were overlaid on a country that had been, barely a generation before, the exclusive territory of the Palawa. The transformation was visible in its progress and its direction, and the direction was one way. The men who owned the properties that you passed on that journey were, in many cases, already prosperous by the mid-1820s. The speed of their prosperity was, as this account has argued, not simply a function of their agricultural activity. It was a function of the capital they had brought with them, the connections they had maintained, the commercial networks they had accessed, and the administrative arrangements that Arthur's governance had created and maintained. The landscape through which you traveled was, in its pastoral beauty, a beautiful version of a story that was considerably more complex than the pastoral romance would suggest. That complexity is what this account has been attempting to recover, not to diminish the achievement of what was built in those years, which was real and in many respects remarkable, but to place that achievement in its proper context, a context that includes the origins of the capital, the sources of the labor, the methods of the land acquisition, and the commercial networks through which all of these were connected. The proper context makes the achievement more interesting, not less. It transforms the story from a simple pastoral romance into something more like a detective story, a story in which the clues are scattered across multiple archives and multiple continents, and in which the solution, when it eventually comes, will tell us something important about how wealth moves through the world and how societies are built on foundations that their subsequent histories are not always eager to acknowledge. The detective work is not complete. This account has not solved the mystery of the 1820s Tasmanian fortunes. It has outlined the mystery, identified the most significant clues, and argued for the plausibility of a set of explanations that the official history has not adequately engaged with. The complete solution requires the kind of sustained archival research that no single account can substitute for, research that would need to draw on archives in Tasmania and in Britain and in America and in India and possibly in South America, and that would need to engage with the comparative history of colonial capital formation in ways that place the Tasmanian case in its proper global context. That research would be worth doing. The mystery of where the money came from, the money that built the stone houses and established the merino flocks and created the colonial aristocracy of Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s, is a mystery that touches on some of the most significant questions in the history of the British Empire and of colonial societies more generally. It is also a mystery that, in its specific Tasmanian form, has been neglected for too long. The neglect ends here, in the sense that this account has named it and described it and argued for its significance. The work of ending it fully, through the sustained archival investigation that the mystery requires, is a project for others, for historians and archivists and researchers with the time and the access and the expertise that the project demands. This account has tried to make the case for why that project matters. The rest is for those who will actually do it. There is one final thread to pick up, and it is the thread that connects the specific story of 1820s Tasmania to the wider questions about colonial history that this account has been gesturing toward throughout. That thread is the thread of memory, of how we remember colonial periods and what we choose to foreground and what we choose to background in the stories we tell about them. Tasmania, like other societies with complex colonial histories, has made certain choices about how to remember its past. The choices have generally been in the direction of emphasizing the positive dimensions of the colonial achievement, the built heritage, the pastoral tradition, the contribution of the early families to the development of the island's economy and institutions, while backgrounding the more uncomfortable dimensions, the origins of the capital, the convict labor system, the dispossession of the Aboriginal population. Those choices reflect the social function of historical memory, which is partly to provide a foundation story that a community can be comfortable with. They are understandable choices. They are also choices that have consequences. Consequences for the accuracy of the historical record, for the justice due to those whose contributions to the colonial story have been minimized or ignored, and for the ability of contemporary Tasmanians to understand the society they have inherited. The money that came from somewhere, the labor that was extracted by compulsion, the land that was cleared through violence. These are the foundations on which contemporary Tasmania rests, alongside and inseparably from the genuine enterprise and vision and agricultural skill of the men and women who built the colonial society. Acknowledging both dimensions of the foundation is not an act of historical condemnation. It is an act of historical honesty, and it is the minimum that a serious engagement with the past requires. Tasmania in the 1820s was a remarkable place in ways that this account has tried to make visible. The wealth that appeared there in that decade was remarkable in its speed and its scale. The families that assembled that wealth were remarkable in their connections and their ambitions and their ability to construct, in the space of a generation, a social order of considerable durability. The landscape in which they did it is beautiful, in ways that the stone houses and the rolling pastoral hills only partly account for. And the stories embedded in that landscape, the stories of the Palawa who had lived there for 35,000 years, the stories of the convicts who built the houses and cleared the land, the stories of the settlers who arrived with capital of uncertain origin and invested it in a colony that offered both opportunity and obscurity, are stories that deserve to be fully told. They are not yet fully told. This account is one contribution to the telling. The rest waits in the archives, in the records that have not yet been examined with the attention they deserve, in the questions that have not yet been asked, with the persistence they require. The stone houses will still be standing when those questions are finally answered. They are built well enough for that. And perhaps that is the most important thing this account can leave with you. The durability of what was built in 1820s, Tasmania is not, ultimately, a testament to the righteousness of how it was built. It is a testament to the effectiveness of the combination of capital and labor and land that produced it, a combination whose full character this account has tried to illuminate, and whose implications extend far beyond the small island on which the stone houses stand. The island is still there, the questions are still there, and the answers, or as much of the answers as the surviving evidence will support, are waiting to be found. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over old colonial landscapes in the late afternoon, when the light comes at a low angle from the west, and the shadows of the stone buildings stretch long across the paddocks. It is a silence that is full rather than empty, a silence that carries within it the accumulated weight of everything that happened in those places, and everything that has been said and not said about it since. Anyone who has spent time in the Tasmanian Midlands will recognize what is being described. It is one of the most distinctive qualities of that landscape, this feeling of density in the stillness, of history present in the quality of the light. The feeling is not romantic nostalgia, or not only that, it is a response to a genuine density of historical experience, to the fact that the landscape around you was shaped, within a relatively recent historical period, by events of considerable significance, events whose consequences are still unfolding in various ways, and whose full story has not been adequately told. The old sandstone houses, weathered now to a warm grey gold, the overgrown gardens, the stone walls that run along the roadsides, marking boundaries established in the 1820s and 1830s. These physical traces carry information about the past that their beauty does not, by itself, communicate. What they communicate, when you approach them with historical curiosity rather than aesthetic appreciation alone, is a set of questions about origins and processes and consequences that the landscape preserves in its physical form, even when the documentary record is incomplete. The fences tell you about property boundaries established through a particular system of land grants. The orientation of the buildings tells you about the sources of capital and craft skill that produced them. The distance between the major properties and the minor ones tells you about the distribution of resources in the colonial economy and the social hierarchy that distribution both reflected and reproduced. The absence, in most of this landscape, of any visible trace of the people who lived in it before the colonial period tells you about a process of dispossession whose thoroughness was remarkable even by the standards of colonial history. Reading a landscape as historical evidence requires a particular kind of attention, one that is simultaneously visual and historical and analytical. It is not the attention of the heritage tourist, who sees beauty and history and the romance of old places. It is the attention of the investigator, who sees traces and asks what they tell us about causes and processes that are not immediately visible in what survives. The Tasmanian Midlands rewards this kind of attention generously, because the traces are well preserved and because the questions they raise are significant ones. The most significant of those questions, the one this account has been circling, is the question of capital. Where did the money come from that built this landscape in the space of a single generation? The question has been approached from several angles in the preceding discussion, through the maritime history of the region, through the commercial networks of the early colonial period, through the administrative arrangements that shaped the distribution of colonial resources, and through the specific stories of some of the individual families involved. What remains to be done is to synthesize those approaches into a clearer statement of what the evidence suggests and what it leaves uncertain. The evidence suggests, first and most clearly, that the pace of wealth accumulation in Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s was faster than the documented productivity of the colonial economy in those years can account for. The output of the pastoral and agricultural operations of the settled districts was growing rapidly in the 1820s, but the capital invested in land development, building construction, stock acquisition, and infrastructure was growing faster. The gap between documented income and documented expenditure is real and persistent across the records of the period, and it points toward the existence of capital sources that are not fully reflected in the official commercial record. The evidence suggests, second, that the major families of the colonial establishment had connections to each other and to the broader commercial world of the British Empire that preceded their arrival in the colony, and that went beyond what their documented backgrounds in England and Scotland and Ireland would readily explain. The speed and completeness with which those connections were activated in the colonial context implies that they were not built in the colony but were transplanted there, which in turn implies that the men involved had commercial relationships of some depth before they became Tasmanian pastoralists. The evidence suggests, third, that the maritime networks connected to Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s, including the sealing and whaling industries and the broader Pacific commerce of the period, were more complex and less fully documented than the official trade statistics imply, and that some of the capital that entered the colonial economy through those maritime channels was generated by activities that could not be openly acknowledged in the commercial record. The evidence is less clear, fourth, about the specific mechanisms through which that undocumented capital was moved into the colonial economy, and about the specific nature of the commercial activities from which it derived. The gaps in the commercial record that would be most informative about these mechanisms are also the gaps that are most difficult to fill from the surviving documentation. What survives is consistent with several different explanations, ranging from the relatively benign capital from legitimate but undeclared private trade in the colonial networks of the East India Company and the Pacific, to the more complex capital from the disrupted commerce of the Napoleonic and immediate post-Napoleonic period that included activities whose legality was, at best, ambiguous, to the more dramatic capital from the kind of commerce that operated explicitly outside legal boundaries in the chaos of the South American independence period and the associated disruption of established trade routes. The honest assessment is that the surviving evidence does not allow a definitive choice among these explanations, and that the most likely reality is some combination of all of them. The colonial Pacific in the 1820s was a commercial world of considerable complexity and considerable opacity, and men who operated in it successfully did so by being flexible in their commercial practices and careful about the documentation of those practices. The capital that resulted from that flexibility and that care found its way into the land grants and the stone houses and the fine wool of Van Diemen's Land, and the evidence of its existence survives in the gap between what the colonial economy produced and what it spent. The synthesis of these threads leads to a conclusion that is both more interesting and more troubling than the official story of colonial enterprise. It leads to the conclusion that the Tasmanian colonial establishment of the 1820s was built on a combination of undocumented capital, coerced labor, and dispossessed land, and that the relative success of that combination in producing a durable social order reflects not the righteousness of the enterprise, but the effectiveness of the management of its three foundational elements. The management was effective because it was deliberate. The men who built the Tasmanian colonial establishment knew what they were doing. They understood the relationship between capital and land and labor in the specific context of colonial enterprise. They understood how to use the administrative structures of colonial government to serve their private interests, while presenting those interests as aligned with the public good of colonial development. And they understood how to construct social institutions, churches, schools, formal and informal networks of connection and obligation that would preserve their position across generations, and that would shape the historical memory of the colonial period in ways that served their descendants. That last understanding may be the most significant of the three. The ability to shape historical memory is a form of power that is often underestimated in comparison to the more obvious forms of economic and political power. But it is, in the long run, one of the most effective forms, because it determines how subsequent generations understand the world they have inherited, and therefore what questions they think to ask about it. The historical memory of 1820s Tasmania has been shaped in ways that have consistently minimized the questions this account has been asking. The founders of the colonial establishment are remembered as visionary settlers who built a society from nothing. The convicts who provided their labor are remembered, if they are remembered at all, as the unfortunate products of a criminal justice system whose severity we now recognize as excessive. The Aboriginal people whose land was appropriated are remembered as the tragic victims of historical forces that, while regrettable, were in some sense inevitable. And the capital that funded the whole enterprise is not really remembered at all, except as the natural outcome of colonial enterprise and hard work and agricultural skill. This memory is not deliberately false, in the sense that the people who constructed it knew it to be false. It is selectively true, in the sense that it emphasizes the elements of the colonial story that are most compatible with a positive foundation narrative and minimizes the elements that are not. The selection process has been ongoing for 200 years, refined with each generation of historical writing and each iteration of the heritage and tourism industries that have made the colonial past a commodity in the contemporary Tasmanian economy. The commodity is valuable. The heritage tourism industry generates significant revenue for the Tasmanian economy, and the colonial properties that anchor it are genuine architectural achievements of considerable historical significance. But the value of the commodity does not depend on the accuracy of the historical narrative attached to it. Heritage tourism can operate equally well with a more honest account of the colonial past, and arguably the more honest account would make the story more interesting rather than less, because complexity and ambiguity are qualities that serious visitors to historical sites often find more engaging than simple romance. The shift toward a more honest account of the colonial past is something that is happening in various ways and at various paces across the Australian historical landscape. The acknowledgement of the violence of the frontier, the recognition of the complexity of the convict system and the people within it, the growing engagement with Aboriginal history and its significance for understanding the colonial period, all of these represent movements toward a more complete historical understanding that has been gathering momentum over recent decades. Tasmania is part of that movement, though the specific questions about the origins of the colonial capital have not, as this account has noted, received the attention they deserve. The attention is overdue. The capital question is not a minor one. It connects directly to some of the most significant historical and contemporary issues in Tasmanian and Australian life. It connects to questions about the ownership and use of land that are still contested, in various forms, in the legal and political landscape of contemporary Australia. It connects to questions about the relationship between private wealth and public authority that are as relevant now as they were in the 1820s. And it connects to questions about the nature of colonial memory and the purposes it serves that are central to any serious engagement with the colonial past. Those questions will not be resolved by this account, which has neither the scope nor the resources to do the full investigative work they require. But they can be named and defined and argued for with sufficient clarity that the investigators who do take them up will know what they are looking for and why it matters. The money came from somewhere. The land was cleared by someone under compulsion. The people who had managed that land for 35,000 years were driven from it through organized violence. The families who benefited from all of these processes constructed a social order of remarkable durability and a historical narrative of remarkable selectivity. The narrative has served them well for 200 years. It may serve them less well as the questions become more insistent and the archival resources available to answer them become more accessible. The digitization of historical archives, which has been proceeding rapidly across the institutions that hold relevant material, will make the comparative analysis that this account has argued for much more practically feasible in the coming years. The shipping records of multiple nations can now be compared across digital platforms in ways that would have required years of physical archival work a generation ago. The commercial records of the East India Company, which are held in the British Library, are increasingly accessible in digitized form. The records of the early colonial banks, to the extent that they survive, can be analyzed with tools that were not available to earlier historians. The landscape of archival possibility has changed significantly in the past 2 decades, and it will continue to change. That changing landscape creates new opportunities for the investigation that the mystery of the 1820s Tasmanian fortunes requires. The investigation will not be simple, because the gaps in the record are real, and because the opacity of some of the commercial channels involved was deliberate, and therefore resistant to after-the-fact reconstruction. But the investigation is more feasible now than it has ever been, and the reasons for conducting it are more clearly understood than they were when the colonial historians of a century ago were laying down the foundation narrative that subsequent historical work has largely built on, rather than challenged. The challenge is overdue. Let's step back from the specifically Tasmanian story for a moment and situate it within the broader history of colonial capital formation that provides its proper context, because the Tasmanian case is more comprehensible and more significant when it is understood as one example of a global phenomenon, rather than as an isolated peculiarity of a small island's development. The British Empire in the first half of the 19th century was a capital mobilizing machine of extraordinary power and reach. The capital it mobilized came from multiple sources, some of them clearly legitimate, some of them legally ambiguous, and some of them explicitly criminal by the standards of the time, and even more clearly criminal by contemporary standards. The profits of the slave trade, which Britain formally abolished in 1807, but whose economic consequences continued to shape British commerce and capital markets for decades afterward, were one major source. The profits of the opium trade, which the East India Company operated as a state monopoly and which moved enormous quantities of Bengal opium to China in exchange for silver that then circulated through the commercial networks of the British Empire, were another. The profits of the plantation economies of the Caribbean, built on enslaved labor and producing sugar and cotton and tobacco for metropolitan markets, were a third. These sources of capital were not clearly separated from the legitimate commercial activities of the empire in the way that a simple moral account might suggest. The merchants who traded in legitimate goods often also had interests in the less legitimate dimensions of colonial commerce. The bankers who financed respectable colonial enterprises also, in various degrees, managed capital that had its origins in the opium trade or in the plantation economy. The investors who put money into colonial ventures, like the Van Diemen's Land Company, were drawing on pools of capital whose full composition was not always transparent even to the investors themselves. The movement of colonial capital into the investment opportunities provided by the expansion of British settlement in the Australian colonies was a natural development of this broader pattern of colonial capital formation. The Australian colonies offered land, labour and commodity production opportunities that were, in many respects, superior to those available in the older colonial contexts of the Caribbean and India. Land was abundant and available through the government's grant system at minimal cost. Labour, through the convict assignment system, was essentially free. And the pastoral commodities that the land could produce, wool and beef and later wheat and other agricultural products, had markets both in Britain and in the growing internal markets of the colonial world. The men who moved capital from the older colonial contexts into the Australian opportunity were therefore not simply entrepreneurs seeking new frontiers. They were participants in a longer history of colonial capital formation, men who had accumulated capital through the complex commercial world of the early 19th century British Empire, and who were looking for investment opportunities that combined the profitable with the respectable, that could turn money of ambiguous origin into the clearly documented product of agricultural enterprise. Van Diemen's Land was particularly well suited to this purpose. Its remoteness, while inconvenient in practical terms, was an advantage from the perspective of obscuring the origins of invested capital. Its administrative structure, under Arthur's management, was efficient enough to protect property rights and facilitate commercial activity while being sufficiently opaque, from the perspective of London oversight, to allow a degree of flexibility in how the colonial economy was managed. And its pastoral potential, which was real and becoming rapidly clear through the 1820s, provided a legitimate and profitable destination for capital that needed a legitimate and profitable destination. This broader context does not explain every specific detail of the Tasmanian case, but it provides the framework within which the specific details become comprehensible. The pace of wealth accumulation, the prior connections of the major families, the maritime networks, the administrative arrangements, all of these are specific manifestations of a general pattern of colonial capital formation that was operating across the British Empire in the early 19th century. Tasmania's specificity within that general pattern has to do with the particular combination of conditions that it offered, a combination that was, in certain respects, unique. The Bay Strait, with its history of largely unregulated maritime activity, provided a channel for the movement of capital and goods that was more opaque than the channels available in more closely monitored colonial contexts. The convict labor system provided a supply of essentially free skilled labor that was available nowhere else in the colonial world in the same form. The Aboriginal population was, in comparison to other colonial contexts, relatively small and concentrated in the settled areas in ways that made its dispossession more rapid and more complete than was possible in larger and more geographically dispersed Aboriginal societies on the mainland. And the pastoral potential of the island was genuine and accessible in ways that made the transformation of capital into legitimate pastoral wealth relatively straightforward. The combination was, from a certain perspective, nearly ideal for the purpose of capital transformation, and the men who recognized and exploited it were making a sophisticated commercial judgment that their subsequent historical reputation as simple pastoral pioneers does not adequately capture. The sophistication of that judgment is one of the most interesting aspects of the early Tasmanian story, and it is one that the abbreviated official history has consistently understated. The vision required to see Van Diemen's Land in the early 1820s as the investment opportunity it was, and to act on that vision quickly enough and at sufficient scale to capture the full benefit of it, was a vision informed by commercial experience and financial sophistication of a kind that the documented backgrounds of the major settlers do not always clearly account for. Where did that vision come from? The answer, this account has argued, is that it came from a prior engagement with the commercial world of the British Empire in its more complex manifestations, an engagement that provided both the capital and the commercial understanding to exploit the Tasmanian opportunity effectively. The legacy of that exploitation is the landscape we have been examining. The stone houses and the pastoral estates and the colonial institutions and the social hierarchy that persisted through generations. All of these are the visible products of a process of capital formation and colonial development that was more complex and more opaque than the foundation stories that subsequent generations have found comfortable to tell. The visible products are real, and they have value, both economic and historical and aesthetic, but they are not the whole story. The whole story includes the sources of the capital, the conditions of the labor, the process of the land acquisition, and the networks of commercial and political power through which all of these were managed. The whole story is worth telling. It is more interesting than the abbreviated version, more honest, and more useful as a basis for understanding how colonial societies were built and how their foundational choices continue to shape the societies that inherit them. Tasmania today is a place of considerable beauty and considerable complexity, a place whose history is more fully visible in its physical landscape than it is in the histories that have been written about it. The stone houses and the colonial churches and the convict-built bridges and the pastoral hills are all there, waiting for the historical attention that will place them in their proper context. That context, as this account has tried to demonstrate, is a context of colonial capital formation, coerced labor, indigenous dispossession, and maritime commercial opacity that stretches far beyond the island itself and connects it to the wider history of the British Empire and of colonial expansion in the early 19th century. The connection is real, the complexity is real, and the questions that the complexity raises are questions that deserve, after 2 centuries of relative neglect, to be asked with the seriousness and the sustained attention that they require. The money came from somewhere, the land was cleared, the people were removed. The story has not been fully told. It should be. Now, let's move into the strangest and most specific of the puzzles that the 1820s Tasmanian story presents, the puzzle of a particular kind of document that appears in the colonial archives of the period, with a regularity that is, when you examine it carefully, more than a little strange. The documents in question are letters of introduction. In the early 19th century, a letter of introduction was a social document of considerable importance. When a person traveled to a new place where they were not known, they typically carried letters from people in their home community to people in the new place, letters that vouched for the traveler's character and social standing, and that requested the recipient to extend courtesies and assistance to the bearer. The system was the social networking mechanism of the pre-telegraph world, and it was taken seriously. A letter of introduction from a respected individual to another respected individual was a significant form of social currency. The letters of introduction carried by some of the major figures in the early Tasmanian colonial establishment are preserved in various collections, in Tasmanian and British archives. And what they reveal, when examined collectively, is a pattern that is consistent with the argument this account has been making. The letters are often from individuals whose backgrounds are not fully documented, vouching for travelers whose backgrounds are similarly opaque to recipients in the colony who are already embedded in the colonial establishment. The network they describe is a network of mutual recognition and mutual interest, and the basis of the mutual recognition is not always clearly the kind of legitimate professional or social connection that letters of introduction were supposed to describe. Some of the letters are perfectly conventional, from identifiable English or Scottish families to identifiable colonial figures, on the basis of the kind of social connection that the colonial gentry found natural and useful. But some of them are from figures who are harder to trace, and whose connection to the bearer is described in terms that are vague enough to cover a range of possible relationships, from the legitimate to the considerably less so. This is speculative, as much of this account has been. Letters of introduction are not confessions, and the vagueness of some of them may simply reflect the conventional imprecision of the genre rather than any deliberate concealment. But the pattern of the network they describe, combined with the other evidence of prior connection among the major colonial families, adds to the overall impression of a colonial establishment whose internal connections had deeper roots than the official historical record has clearly established. The physical archives of early Tasmania, which are distributed among several institutions, most importantly the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office in Hobart, the State Library of New South Wales for records that straddle the colonial boundary, and various British archives for the metropolitan connections, contain a great deal of material that has not been subjected to the kind of systematic analysis that the questions this account raises would require. The material is there. The analytical framework for approaching it, which this account has tried to provide, is available. The investigation has not been conducted. There are practical reasons for that. Archival research of the kind that would be required is labor-intensive and time-consuming, requiring sustained engagement with documents that are physically dispersed and that are written in the hands of the early 19th century that not all researchers are equally equipped to read. The funding for that kind of research is not easy to obtain, particularly for questions that are not obviously connected to the mainstream concerns of the institutions that fund historical research. And the professional incentives in academic historical research do not always align well with the sustained attention to a single focused question that this investigation would require. But these are practical obstacles rather than insurmountable ones, and the growing accessibility of digitized archival material is steadily reducing the practical barriers to the comparative analysis that the question demands. The shipping records that would be most informative about the maritime networks of the early colonial period are among the categories of archival material that are being most actively digitized, in part because their value for genealogical and economic history research has created demand for digital access. The commercial records of the East India Company, which are directly relevant to the India connection that several of the major colonial figures had in their backgrounds, are now extensively accessible through the British Library's digitization program. The American whaling and sealing records that connect to the Bass Strait networks are being preserved and made accessible through the New England Whaling Museum archives. The investigation is becoming more feasible every year. The question is whether the historical community will recognize the importance of conducting it and whether the institutional and funding support for that investigation will be mobilized before the evidence becomes any more fragmentary than it already is. The answer to that question depends, in part, on the attention that stories like this one draw to the questions that the evidence raises. History is not an autonomous discipline that advances entirely through the internal logic of scholarly discourse. It is a social practice that is responsive to the questions that society considers important, and the questions that this account has been raising are ones that a society genuinely engaged with its colonial past should consider important. Tasmania is engaged with its colonial past in various ways. The development of formal processes of acknowledgement of the Aboriginal history of the island, including the formal recognition of Aboriginal Tasmanians as a distinct community with historical rights to land and cultural heritage, represents a significant movement in the direction of historical honesty. The World Heritage Listing of the Convict Sites, which brings international attention to the convict dimension of the colonial story, is another. These are genuine movements toward a more complete historical understanding. The capital question, the question of where the money came from, is the dimension of the story that has lagged behind. It is the dimension that is least emotionally salient, perhaps, in comparison to the more viscerally engaging stories of the convict experience and the frontier violence. But it is the dimension that, in a certain sense, underlies all the others, because the capital was what organized and directed both the convict labor and the process of land dispossession. Without the capital, neither of the other elements could have produced what it did. The capital was the organizing principle of the colonial enterprise, and understanding its origins is therefore essential to understanding the enterprise as a whole. This account has argued that those origins are more complex and more obscure than the official history has acknowledged. It has traced the implications of that obscurity through the maritime networks, the commercial records, the administrative arrangements, and the family connections of the colonial period. And it has made the case that a proper investigation of those origins would produce a more complete and more honest account of how the colonial establishment of Van Diemen's Land was built and why its legacy has been so durable. The case has been made, The investigation remains to be conducted, and the money is still, in a historical sense, waiting to be traced back to wherever it came from. There is a particular quality that the light has on the Tasmanian Midlands in the early morning of a clear winter day. The frost lies white on the paddocks and on the roofs of the stone outbuildings, and the air is absolutely still. The light comes from the east, in long horizontal rays that catch the sandstone of the old houses and turn it from grey to gold, and in that light, the properties look exactly as they must have looked to the first people who built them. Substantial and deliberate and made to last. They have lasted. The stone houses of the Tasmanian colonial period have endured through 2 centuries of Tasmanian history, through the economic transformations that have repeatedly reshaped the island's economy, through the social changes that have altered the character of the communities around them, through the wars and depressions and political upheavals that have tested every institution in Australian society. They endure partly because they were well built by craftsmen whose skill was not diminished by the conditions of their employment. And they endure partly because the social and institutional structures around them, created by the same colonial establishment that built the houses, have proved resilient enough to protect the properties through the changes that might otherwise have threatened them. That resilience is not incidental. It is the product of the same deliberate social engineering that produced the houses themselves. The colonial establishment of the 1820s did not simply build stone houses. It built the legal and institutional frameworks that protected the property rights the houses embodied. It built the social networks that maintained the value and the significance of the houses through subsequent generations. It built the historical narratives that placed the houses in a context that enhanced their value as cultural heritage. And it built the political connections that ensured the houses and the estates around them would be treated with the appropriate degree of institutional respect by the colonial and, later, state governments that administered the public interest in private historical property. This is what a ruling class does when it is operating effectively. It does not simply accumulate wealth. It creates the conditions under which wealth is preserved and transmitted across generations, and it shapes the public narrative in ways that support and legitimize that preservation. The colonial establishment of Van Diemen's Land was very good at this. It built houses that lasted 200 years, and it built the social and institutional structures that ensured those houses would be recognized, when the time came, as the heritage of a whole community, rather than simply as the property of the families that built them. The recognition as heritage is the final, most subtle, and perhaps most effective form of the capital protection that the colonial establishment created. When a private property becomes a public heritage site, its maintenance is guaranteed not by the resources of its private owners, but by the resources of the public institutions that manage it. The families whose ancestors built the houses may no longer own them, but the houses are preserved, protected, and presented to the public in a way that maintains and enhances the historical reputation of the families that built them, a reputation that is itself a form of social capital that persists and compounds across generations. The heritage industry is therefore, among other things, a form of the management of historical memory that this account has been discussing. It preserves the physical evidence of the colonial past while, in many cases, framing that evidence in ways that emphasize the aspects of the story that are most compatible with a positive evaluation of the colonial enterprise. The stone houses are presented as examples of architectural achievement and historical significance. The convict labor that built them is acknowledged, but within a narrative frame that emphasizes the injustice done to the convicts rather than the economic calculation of the men who employed them. The Aboriginal history of the land on which the houses stand is increasingly acknowledged, but often as a separate story, rather than as part of the same story that includes the capital and the architecture and the pastoral enterprise. The integration of these different dimensions of the story into a single, coherent historical account is the project that this account has been advancing. The project is not complete in these pages. It cannot be complete without the archival investigation that has been repeatedly called for throughout this discussion. But it is begun, in the sense that the connections among the different dimensions have been traced, and the framework for a more complete account has been outlined. What would that more complete account look like? It would look like a history of the capital formation of the Tasmanian colonial establishment that began, not with the arrival of the first settlers, but with the commercial worlds they came from, the maritime networks of the Pacific, the commercial networks of India, the financial disruptions of the Napoleonic period, the complex commercial relationships of the Bass Strait and the Southern Ocean. It would trace the movement of capital from those contexts into the pastoral economy of Van Diemen's Land through the specific mechanisms that the evidence, while incomplete, does allow to be partially reconstructed. And it would connect that capital formation to the labor and land dimensions of the colonial story in ways that make the whole process comprehensible as a unified historical phenomenon rather than a collection of separately managed narratives. Such a history would be more difficult to tell than the official version. It would require more qualification and more acknowledgement of uncertainty. It would be more uncomfortable for the descendants of the families whose origins it examines. But it would be more true, and it would be more useful as a foundation for the historical understanding that a society genuinely engaged with its colonial past requires. The truth of the colonial past is not simple, and the telling of it should not be simple. The stone houses of the Tasmanian Midlands are not simple. They are the products of capital and coercion and craft and aspiration, of commercial networks that stretched halfway around the world, and of labor systems that stretched across the full moral spectrum, from the merely unjust to the genuinely brutal. They are beautiful and they are problematic, and they are part of a story that is still being told, still being contested, still being understood. This account has tried to add something to that understanding, to make the questions clearer and the framework for answering them more explicit. The questions are there. The evidence, incomplete as it is there. The investigation is waiting to be done. The light is still gold on the old sandstone in the early morning. The frost is still on the paddocks. The silence is still full. And somewhere in the archives, the records of where the money came from are still waiting to tell their story to anyone willing to go looking for them. Now, if you have traveled with this account from its beginning, you have covered the length of a particular kind of historical journey, the kind that starts with a simple observation. In this case, the suspicious pace of wealth accumulation in a colonial backwater, and follows the implications of that observation through the archives and the commercial networks and the landscape until you arrive somewhere considerably more complex than where you started. Where you arrive, in this case, is at a conclusion that can be stated simply even though the argument behind it is not simple. The wealth of 1820s Tasmania was assembled from sources and through processes that the official historical record only partially acknowledges. The origins of that wealth, in the maritime and commercial networks of the early 19th century British Empire, in the ambiguous commercial channels of the colonial Pacific, and in the administrative arrangements of a colonial government that managed its resources in ways that consistently favored a small group of well-connected men, are more complex and more interesting and more troubling than the pastoral romance of the foundation story suggests. The social order that wealth created has proved extraordinarily durable. The durability reflects the effectiveness of the colonial establishment's management of its capital, its labor, its land, and its historical narrative. That narrative has been the subject of this account, and the account has argued that the narrative is incomplete in ways that matter, that the questions it does not answer are questions that deserve to be asked and pursued until they yield whatever answers the surviving evidence will support. Those answers will not, in all likelihood, resolve every uncertainty about the specific origins of every colonial fortune assembled in Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s. The gaps in the record are too significant for that. But they will, this account is confident, shift the balance of the historical understanding in ways that make the foundation story of Tasmania more complete and more honest and more useful as a basis for understanding the contemporary world that the colonial period created. That is the purpose of historical investigation at its best. Not to condemn the past or to celebrate it, but to understand it as fully and as honestly as the evidence allows, and to use that understanding as a foundation for a more honest engagement with the present. The stone houses will still be standing when the investigation is done. The question of where the money came from will, with sustained archival effort, yield more of its secrets. And the full story of how the wealthiest families of 1820s Tasmania appeared from somewhere, with their capital and their connections and their ambitions and their remarkable ability to build a social order in a colonial backwater that would last for 200 years, will be somewhat closer to being fully told. The investigation begins, in a sense, with the recognition that the question has not been asked often enough or pursued far enough. This account has tried to provide that recognition. The rest, as always, is for those who will do the work. If you have come this far in the darkness, listening to the questions pile up in the way that they do when history refuses to be simple, you know the feeling that good historical mystery produces. It is not the feeling of resolution. It is the feeling of a thread that keeps going, further back and further sideways than you expected, through archives and landscapes and commercial networks and the lives of people who built something that outlasted them and who never fully explained how they came to be in a position to build it. The thread is still going. The money is still somewhere at the other end of it. And somewhere in the 1820s, on a small island at the bottom of the world, the wealthiest families appeared as if from nowhere, built their stone houses, established their pastoral empires, and set in motion a social order whose foundations nobody has been looking at closely enough for the past 200 years. Nobody, until now. Sleep well, wherever you are in the world. And when you wake up tomorrow morning, perhaps spend a moment thinking about where the old money comes from, in any society. The beautiful old buildings that line the streets of your city, the great houses in the countryside that you pass on the road and admire, the ancient families whose names are attached to institutions and parks and public buildings. Think about where the money came from that built all of that. It is almost always a more interesting story than the official version. And it is almost always, in some dimension, that the official version prefers not to foreground. A story about the movement of capital from somewhere ambiguous into somewhere respectable through the alchemy of land and labor and time and the management of historical memory. Tasmania is one example of that alchemy. It is a beautiful example, in both the literal and the ironic senses of the word beautiful. And it is an example that, like so many things about that strange and wonderful island at the bottom of the world, deserves to be better known. There is a man named Francis Burgess, who appears in the colonial records of Van Diemen's Land in 1822, and who, within 8 years, had assembled one of the more substantial pastoral properties in the settled districts. His name does not appear in most accounts of the colonial period. He is not among the celebrated founding families whose names are attached to the great properties now listed in the heritage registers. He exists in the margins of the record, present in the land grant documents and the wool agents' correspondence and the occasional colonial newspaper reference, but not prominent enough to have attracted the sustained biographical attention that might have illuminated his origins more clearly. What the records do reveal about Burgess is sufficient to make him interesting in the context of this account. He arrived in the colony as a free settler, which is documented. He carried a letter of introduction to a merchant in Hobart Town whose own background was, as this account has noted in relation to similar figures, not fully transparent in the surviving records. He acquired his first land grant in the Northern Midlands in 1823, a block of what the grant document describes as good grazing land adjacent to a creek. He stocked it within the year with a flock of merinos whose quality was noted by the wool assessor who examined them. By 1830, he had expanded the holding significantly and had built a stone farmhouse of modest but solid proportions that still stands, substantially altered, on the property. Where the money came from to stock the initial holding so quickly and to expand it so substantially within 7 years is not clear from the records. The wool income from the first few years, which can be partially reconstructed from the wool agent's correspondence, is not sufficient to account for the pace of expansion. The letter of introduction that Burgess carried connects him to a network of Hobart merchants whose own commercial activities included maritime trading of the kind that this account has been discussing. And the timing of his arrival in the colony, in the same cluster of years as the other major pastoral figures, is consistent with the pattern of organized migration that this account has suggested. Burgess is not the most important figure in the story. He is probably not even among the top 20 in terms of the scale of his eventual holdings or the depth of his subsequent connections to the colonial establishment. But he is useful precisely because he is not one of the celebrated names. He is a representative figure, a man who arrived in the colony at the right moment with enough capital to establish himself in the pastoral economy, who connected himself to the networks of the colonial establishment, and who built a modest but genuine prosperity in the space of a decade. The question of where his money came from is the same question, in miniature, that this account has been asking about the more prominent figures. And the answer, while it cannot be fully documented, is consistent with the general pattern of the analysis. The men who built the Tasmanian colonial establishment were not all giants. Some of them were substantial, some of them were modest. Some of them arrived with significant capital and built great estates. Some of them arrived with less and built smaller ones. But they shared, at the general level of the argument this account has made, a set of conditions in common. They arrived at a particular historical moment. They were connected, in various ways, and to various degrees, to the commercial networks of the early 19th century British Empire. They benefited from the administrative arrangements of a colonial government that managed its resources in ways that favored them. And they converted whatever capital they arrived with into the legitimate pastoral wealth of Van Diemen's Land with a speed and effectiveness that the official story of colonial enterprise, while not false, does not fully explain. The Francis Burgesses of the colonial world are worth attention for the same reason that the celebrated families are worth attention. They fill out the picture. They demonstrate that the pattern of ambiguous capital formation in 1820s, Tasmania was not limited to a handful of exceptional figures, but was distributed across a significant portion of the colonial establishment. The specific origins of each individual's capital differed, as the specific paths that brought them to the colony differed. But the general pattern of arriving with capital of uncertain provenance and converting it into the legitimate pastoral wealth of a developing colony is one that applies across the range of free settlers who built the early Tasmanian establishment. There is another dimension to this story that has not yet been addressed directly, and that is the role of religion and religious community in the social organization of the colonial establishment. The churches that the major pastoral families built and endowed in the 1820s and 1830s were not simply expressions of personal piety, though some of the individuals involved were genuinely devout. They were social institutions that performed specific functions in the management of the colonial community, functions that included the legitimization of the social hierarchy that the pastoral families occupied, the provision of a formal social context in which the networks of the colonial establishment could maintain and reproduce themselves, and the establishment of the colonial family's claims to respectability and social leadership in a community that was, in other respects, defined by its distance from the metropolitan centers of respectability. The Anglican churches of the Tasmanian Midlands are among the most beautiful examples of colonial ecclesiastical architecture in Australia. Built in the 1820s and 1830s, they are small and careful and technically accomplished, the work of convict craftsmen and occasional professional architects, working to designs that adapted the English country church tradition to the Antipodean context. They are also, in their social meaning, highly specific documents of the colonial social order. The pew allocations in the early colonial churches were arranged to reflect and reinforce the social hierarchy of the colonial community. The major pastoral families sat in the front pews, their social inferiors sat behind them. The arrangement was not simply conventional. It was a weekly rehearsal of the social order, a public affirmation that the families who had built the colony occupied the positions of leadership and deference that they claimed. The endowment of the churches by the major families, through donations of land and money and building materials, cemented the connection between the colonial wealth and the institutional structures that legitimized it. A family that had built a church was a family that had demonstrated its commitment to the colonial community in the most public and durable way available. The church stood as evidence of the family's wealth, its piety, and its investment in the long-term welfare of the community it led. It was also evidence, by implication, of the legitimacy of the wealth that made the endowment possible. A family that could build a church was a family whose wealth was substantial enough to be shared for communal benefit, and a family whose wealth was of that kind did not need to answer questions about its origins. The churches therefore served, among their other functions, the function of closing off the capital question. They transformed ambiguous wealth into legitimate social capital in the most visible and enduring way available to the colonial period. And they did so in a context, the religious community, that was traditionally resistant to the kind of commercial scrutiny that might have produced uncomfortable questions about the origins of the endowment. The church was a space of accepted legitimacy, and the donation to it was an act that conferred legitimacy on the donor. The act was calculated as well as pious, in most cases, and its effectiveness in managing the social meaning of colonial wealth has been demonstrated by the subsequent history of these families' reputations. The social functions of religion in the early colonial community extended beyond the management of the capital question. The churches were spaces where the colonial families could present themselves as a coherent social group with shared values and shared commitments, in contrast to the convict population whose labor they employed and whose social status they were deeply invested in, distinguishing from their own. The Sunday gathering, with its implicit reminder of the social hierarchy through the pew allocations and the public recognition of the major donors, was a weekly performance of the colonial social order that reinforced its reality and its legitimacy. For the convicts who attended these services, the experience was more complex. The colonial churches were, officially, spaces of moral instruction and social reform, part of the apparatus of the convict system that aimed to transform transported criminals into productive colonial citizens. In practice, they were spaces in which the social distance between the convict population and the free settler establishment was dramatized and reinforced in ways that served the purposes of the latter more clearly than the former. The message of redemption and social rehabilitation that the colonial churches offered to the convict population was real, in the sense that individuals did move through the convict system and eventually achieve the status of free citizens. But the structural message was that the social hierarchy was fixed and God-given, and that the appropriate response to one's position within it was acceptance and improvement within its terms, rather than questioning of the terms themselves. The religious dimension of the colonial social order is not incidental to the story of the colonial fortunes. It is part of the infrastructure of that social order. One of the mechanisms through which the wealth accumulated in the 1820s was protected and legitimized and transmitted across generations. The churches still stand as evidence of this function, their beauty and their historical significance now detached from the social purposes they originally served, but their presence in the landscape still marking the locations where the colonial establishment most publicly asserted its claim to social leadership and moral respectability. The claim was maintained through the colonial period and into the post-colonial period of Australian self-government. The families that had built the churches continued to sit in the front pews through the 19th century and into the 20th. The social networks of the colonial establishment, maintained through the churches and the pastoral associations and the colonial councils and the magistrates' benches, persisted as the framework of Tasmanian social organisation long after the specific conditions that had created them had changed. This persistence is what makes the story of the origins of the colonial wealth so relevant to the contemporary situation. The social order created by the 1820s investment has not simply been superseded by subsequent historical developments. It has been modified and adapted and, in some respects, democratized, but it has not been fundamentally transformed. The basic structure of Tasmanian social organisation, which reflects the colonial period's concentration of economic and institutional power in a relatively small group of families and their descendants, is still recognizable in the contemporary institutions of Tasmanian society. That is a strong claim, and it should be qualified. Tasmania in the 21st century is not simply the colonial establishment of the 1820s in different clothing. The social changes of the past 2 centuries, including the extension of the franchise, the development of trade unionism, the migration of new populations to the island, the development of new industries, the formal recognition of Aboriginal rights, all of these have substantially altered the social landscape, but they have not erased the traces of the original colonial order, and those traces are visible in the institutional culture and the social networks and the distribution of economic and cultural power that continue to characterize Tasmanian society. The investigation of the origins of the colonial wealth is therefore not merely a historical exercise. It is an investigation into the foundations of the contemporary social order, an inquiry into the conditions that produce the distribution of power and resources that contemporary Tasmanians have inherited. That inheritance is complex and contested, and understanding it more fully is a prerequisite for engaging with it honestly. The engagement requires the acknowledgement that the foundations are, in some important respects, less solid than they appear from the perspective of the official history. The official history presents the colonial establishment as the product of enterprise and vision and hard work and colonial opportunity. Those elements are real, but they are not the whole story. The whole story includes the ambiguous capital, the coerced labor, the dispossessed land, and the networks of power that shaped all of these into the durable social order that 2 centuries of subsequent history has been built on. The whole story deserves to be told. The telling of it is an act of historical justice, not in the narrow sense of assigning blame for past wrongs, but in the broader sense of providing an accurate account of how things came to be the way they are. That accurate account is the foundation on which any genuine engagement with the colonial past must rest. The money came from somewhere. The story of where it came from is the story this account has been trying to tell. It is not yet fully told, but it is further along because of the attention that this account has given to it than it was when we started. The thread has been followed through the maritime networks, through the commercial records, through the administrative arrangements, through the landscape, through the specific stories of specific people, and through the institutional structures that the original investment created and maintained. The thread keeps going, the archives are still there, the records are still waiting, and the question of where the wealthiest families of 1820s Tasmania came from, and where their money came from, and what they were connected to before they arrived on their island at the bottom of the world and started building stone houses that still stand 200 years later, is a question that has not yet received the definitive answer it deserves. The search continues, and for those who are inclined to join it, who feel the pull of historical mystery and the satisfaction of following evidence through archives and landscapes toward whatever truth it yields, Tasmania and its colonial period offer a rich field for investigation. The light is still gold on the old sandstone in the early morning. The frost is still on the paddocks. The silence is still full of what is not being said. And somewhere, in a collection of shipping records in a British archive, or a set of commercial correspondence in a Tasmanian collection, or a series of banking ledgers in an archive that nobody has yet thought to connect to this particular question, the answer is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. 200 years is a long time for a question to wait, but questions that important tend to wait as long as they need to. This one is still waiting. Go to sleep now, wherever you are in the world, in whatever time zone, and whatever city or countryside or island or coast. The questions will still be there when you wake up. The archives will still be there. The stone houses will still be there. And the mystery of the money that built them, the money that came from somewhere and went into the foundations of a social order that has lasted 2 centuries, will still be there. But so will the people who want to understand it. And that is enough. There is one more story to tell before this account can be complete, and it is a story about what happens when the questions this account has been raising are not asked. What happens to a society that builds itself on foundations that are not fully examined, that maintains an official narrative about its origins, that is selective in the ways this account has described, and that passes that narrative from generation to generation as the accepted account of how things came to be? What happens is that the society becomes, in certain specific ways, less able to understand itself than it might otherwise be. Not because the people in it are unintelligent or incurious, but because the framework they have been given for understanding their history does not include the questions that would yield the most important answers. The framework says that the wealth was earned through enterprise and hard work. The framework does not include the tools for examining what enterprise and hard work meant in the specific context of colonial Van Diemen's Land, with its convict labor system and its aboriginal dispossession and its maritime commercial networks of ambiguous character. Without those tools, certain contemporary questions become very difficult to address. Questions about the relationship between private wealth and public resources in Tasmania. Questions about the distribution of economic opportunity in a society where some families have had significant advantages since the 1820s. Questions about the relationship between the contemporary marginalisation of Aboriginal Tasmanians and the historical processes through which the land on which contemporary Tasmanian prosperity rests was acquired. These questions are not unanswerable, but they are much harder to answer when the historical framework available for addressing them is the partial one that the official narrative provides. The provision of better tools, of a more complete historical framework, is one of the contributions that a more honest account of the colonial period can make to contemporary Tasmanian society. This is not a radical claim. It is the claim that every society that takes its history seriously makes, that understanding where you came from helps you understand where you are, and that the understanding of where you came from requires the fullest possible engagement with the historical evidence, including the evidence that complicates the official story. Tasmania is ready for that engagement. The conversations about Aboriginal history and colonial violence that have been developing in Tasmania over recent decades demonstrate a community willing to engage with difficult aspects of its past. The extension of that willingness to the question of colonial capital formation is the next step, and it is a step that the evidence supports and that historical honesty requires. The families that built the colonial establishment of Van Diemen's Land were building something that they intended to last. They succeeded, more completely perhaps than they knew. What they built has lasted 2 centuries and continues to shape the society that Tasmania is today. Understanding what they built, in its full complexity, requires understanding how they built it, which requires understanding where the resources came from that made the building possible. That is the question. It has been asked here. It deserves to be answered fully by the sustained archival investigation that this account has repeatedly called for, and that the historical importance of the question requires. The old sandstone houses will still be there when the investigation is complete. They are built well enough for that. And the full story of how they came to be built, when it is finally told, will make them more interesting rather than less, because it will replace the partial romance of the official narrative with the full complexity of what actually happened on that small island at the bottom of the world in the years when the wealth appeared, apparently from nowhere, and the families who controlled it shaped the future of a community that is still, in various ways, living with the consequences of what they built. The consequences are real. The questions are real. The money came from somewhere. And now, at last, the question has been named clearly enough that someone, somewhere, might go looking for where that somewhere was. The light is fading over the Midlands now. The long southern evening is coming in from the west, turning the paddocks from green to gold, and the old stone walls from warm grey to shadow. The frost will come again tonight, and in the morning the light will be gold again on the sandstone, and the question will still be there, patient and precise, and finally, properly articulated. Sleep well. The history is still being made, in the archives, in the questions, in the slow and careful work of understanding what really happened in those years when the wealthiest families of Van Diemen's Land appeared from somewhere and built something that nobody has questioned closely enough until now. The questioning has begun, and questions once properly asked have a way of finding their answers eventually. However long the search takes, however many archives must be visited, however many shipping records must be compared and commercial ledgers examined and letters of introduction decoded, the answers are there, somewhere, in the records of where the money came from. And the money, as this account has argued across many thousands of words and through many dimensions of the historical evidence, came from a world that was more complex and more opaque and more connected to the ambiguous commercial operations of the early 19th century British Empire than the pastoral romance of the Tasmanian Foundation story has ever acknowledged. That is the truth of it, or as much of the truth as the current state of the investigation allows to be stated. The rest is for those who will carry the investigation forward, into the archives and the comparative analysis and the sustained historical attention that the mystery deserves. Tasmania is a beautiful island. Its colonial heritage is real and significant. Its history, fully told, is more interesting and more instructive than the partial version that has been current for 200 years. The telling of that full history is the work that remains. This account has tried to define it, to argue for its importance, and to demonstrate that the questions it raises are not merely academic, but are directly connected to the understanding of how colonial societies were built, and how their foundational choices continue to shape the worlds that inherit them. The world that has inherited the choices of 1820s, Tasmania is still with us. It lives in the stone houses and the pastoral landscapes, and the institutional cultures, and the social networks, and the distribution of economic opportunity that characterize contemporary Tasmania. Understanding how that world came to be is the historical project that the mystery of the colonial wealth demands. And the project begins, as this account has tried to show, with the recognition that the official story is incomplete, and that the incomplete story has been in place long enough. The money came from somewhere. It is time to find out where. One more thing deserves to be said about the specific texture of life in Van Diemen's Land in the 1820s, because texture is what makes history real, and the texture of this particular period is something that no amount of structural analysis can fully convey. The colony in the 1820s was a place of extraordinary sensory contrast. The physical beauty of the landscape, which even the most unsentimental colonial administrators acknowledged in their letters home, existed alongside the grimmer realities of the convict system and the frontier violence. The smell of eucalyptus and the sight of an unfamiliar southern sky coexisted with the sound of the lash in the punishment yards and the smell of the prison hulks in the harbour. The warmth of the colonial social gatherings, with their careful attention to metropolitan social convention, took place against a backdrop of violence and coercion that the conventions were designed, in part, to screen from direct view. The men who built the pastoral estates lived in this contrast and, for the most part, managed it by compartmentalizing it. The estate was the space of order and civilization, the paddocks neatly fenced, the house properly furnished, the garden attempting the English forms that the climate would support. Beyond the estate boundaries, the world was less orderly. The convict workers who left the property in the evenings to their quarters in the outbuildings or the nearby convict stations carried with them the experience of the system in ways that the estate's domestic spaces were designed not to contain. The frontier, where the Aboriginal resistance continued through the 1820s, was present in the occasional alarm. The precautions that settlers in the more exposed districts maintained, the military presence that the colonial government deployed to manage the conflict. Living in this landscape required a particular form of psychological management, a capacity to maintain the domestic fiction of ordered colonial civilization in the face of the realities that the fiction was designed to manage. The men who were best at this management were, not coincidentally, often the men who were also best at managing the other forms of ambiguity that the colonial situation presented, including the ambiguity of their capital's origins. The capacity for compartmentalization is a general human quality, but it is one that colonial situations tend to develop and reward in specific ways. A man who can sit at a dinner table with the colonial administration and the leading families and conduct himself with all the forms of English civilization while having access to commercial networks whose character those same forms of civilization would not endorse. That man has a particular quality of social and psychological flexibility that is well adapted to the colonial frontier. Some of the most successful figures in early colonial Australian history had exactly this quality, and the Tasmanian colonial establishment of the 1820s was well supplied with them. The social gatherings of the colonial establishment were themselves performances of a kind that the participants would not necessarily have recognized as performances, any more than people generally recognize their social behavior as performance. But the colonial dinner table, with its careful attention to precedents and its management of the conversation toward approved topics and away from uncomfortable ones, was a space in which the social order was continuously rehearsed and maintained. The topics that were not discussed at those tables were as significant as the ones that were, and the money question was, in the culture of the colonial establishment, very much a topic that was not discussed in any form that would have required direct engagement with the origins of the capital. The social culture of the colonial establishment, with its emphasis on propriety and its management of discourse toward the legitimate and the respectable, was therefore itself a mechanism for protecting the capital question from the scrutiny it deserved, not through any explicit agreement to avoid the topic, but through the social norms that governed what was appropriate to discuss in mixed company, norms that had the practical effect of placing the question of capital origins outside the scope of polite conversation. Those norms have persisted, in various forms, in the historical culture of Tasmania. The history of the colonial period, as it has been written and taught, has largely respected the same norms, treating the wealth of the colonial establishment as a given rather than as a subject of inquiry, as the background against which the interesting stories of colonial life were played out, rather than as itself the most interesting story. The reversal of that treatment, the insistence that the wealth itself is the subject worth examining, and that its origins are the question worth asking, is what this account has attempted. The attempt is incomplete, as this account has acknowledged repeatedly. But the direction is the right one, and the incompleteness is of the kind that can be remedied by the sustained archival investigation that the question demands. The investigation is the task. The question is the starting point. And the starting point is the observation with which this account began. The observation that in the 1820s, on a small island at the bottom of the world, the wealthiest families appeared from nowhere. They did not, of course, appear from nowhere. Nobody appears from nowhere. They came from the commercial world of the early 19th century British Empire, from the maritime networks of the Southern Ocean and the Pacific, from the financial networks of London and Edinburgh and Glasgow, and the counting houses of India and the merchant houses of the Caribbean. They came carrying capital whose origins were various and whose character was, in some cases, deliberately obscured. And they arrived in a colonial context that provided the investment opportunities they needed and the administrative arrangements that managed those investments on favorable terms. That is where they came from. The full details of the journey, the specific channels through which the capital moved, and the specific relationships that facilitated its movement are the details that the archival investigation remains to establish. But the general direction is clear, and the framework for understanding it is provided by the broader history of colonial capital formation in the early 19th century British Empire. The framework is the tool. The investigation is the work. The question is the beginning. Where did the money come from? The answer is still being found. There are a few specific details that deserve a final mention before this account concludes. Details that have been held back not out of reluctance to discuss them, but because they fit most naturally at the end, as the last pieces of a picture that has been assembled through the preceding discussion. The first is the question of what happened to the Van Diemen's Land Company in the long run, because the trajectory of the company, after its initial decades of commercial difficulty, is itself informative about the relationship between private colonial enterprise and the political structures that supported it. The Van Diemen's Land Company survived its early difficulties, as we have noted, in ways that a purely commercial analysis would not have predicted. By the 1840s, it had found a more stable footing, partly through the development of its pastoral operations on the Northwest Plateau, which proved more suitable for cattle grazing than the initial agricultural ambitions had anticipated, and partly through the management of its substantial land assets in ways that generated income through leasing and other arrangements that the original prospectus had not clearly anticipated. The company continued to operate in various forms through the 19th century and into the 20th, and its land holdings in the northwest of Tasmania remained a significant economic and political factor in the island's development. The political influence of the company and of the networks associated with it was a persistent feature of Tasmanian colonial and post-colonial politics. The company's agents and associated families were represented in the colonial councils, and, after self-government in 1855, in the Tasmanian Parliament, in ways that gave the commercial interests of the Northwest a political voice disproportionate to the population of the region. That political influence was itself a legacy of the original land grant, which had created an economic interest powerful enough to command political representation. The second detail is the question of how the Tasmanian colonial establishment dealt with the transition to self-government in 1855, because that transition was itself a political negotiation in which the interests of the established families were carefully protected. The constitution that governed the new self-governing colony of Tasmania was not a document that disturbed the social order that the 1820s had created. The franchise was restricted in ways that ensured the major landowners retained disproportionate influence over the elected institutions. The appointed upper house provided an additional check on any democratic impulse that might challenge the established interests. And the management of the transition itself, which was negotiated between the colonial establishment and the colonial office in London, produced an outcome that the established families found satisfactory. This is not surprising, given who was doing the negotiating. The men who represented Tasmania in the discussions about self-government were, for the most part, men who had inherited their positions and their interests from the colonial establishment of the 1820s and 1830s. They negotiated a constitutional settlement that protected those interests, and they did so successfully. The result was a Tasmanian political system that preserved many of the features of the oligarchic colonial administration, wrapped in the forms of representative government that 19th century liberalism required. The forms mattered, both as political reality and as social performance. The appearance of representative government, with elected institutions and formal political competition, gave the post-colonial social order a legitimacy that the nakedly oligarchic colonial administration had lacked. But the substance of political power continued, for several decades after self-government, to reside in the networks of the established families in ways that the formal political institutions did not fully reflect. The third and final detail is the question of why this matters now, in the 21st century, more than 150 years after Tasmania became self-governing, and more than 200 years after the events this account has been examining. It matters because the social and institutional structures created by the events of the 1820s are still present in various modified forms in contemporary Tasmanian society. The distribution of economic resources in Tasmania, including land ownership, reflects patterns established in the colonial period that have been modified but not erased by subsequent historical developments. The institutional culture of Tasmanian society, including its political culture and its cultural institutions and its patterns of social organization, bears the imprint of the colonial period's concentration of power in relatively few hands. And the historical narrative through which Tasmanians understand their society, the story they tell themselves about where they came from and how they got to be where they are, is still shaped by the partial version of the colonial history that the established families constructed and maintained for their own purposes. The fuller version of that history, which this account has been working toward, would not change the physical landscape or the distribution of resources or the institutional structures overnight. But it would provide a more accurate framework for understanding those things, and a more accurate framework is the prerequisite for any serious engagement with the questions about justice and inheritance and historical responsibility that the colonial past raises. Those questions are being asked in various forms in contemporary Australian society. The Tasmanian contribution to the answering of them requires, among other things, the kind of honest engagement with the colonial past that this account has been arguing for. The money came from somewhere. The land was cleared by someone under compulsion. The people who had lived on the land for 35,000 years were removed from it. The social order that resulted from all of this has been in place for 2 centuries. Understanding it fully, which means understanding not just its consequences, but its origins, is the historical task that Tasmania has not yet completed. The completion of that task is within reach, given the archival resources available and the historical skills that contemporary researchers possess. What has been missing is the sustained attention and the explicit framing of the question in terms clear enough to direct the investigation. This account has tried to provide that framing. The investigation is the work that remains. Sleep well, wherever you are in the world tonight. The old houses are still standing on the Tasmanian Midlands, warm and quiet in the southern night. The questions are still there, patient as the sandstone, and the morning will come again, as it always does, with its gold light and its long shadows and its silence full of everything that has not yet been said. The history of a place is never finished being written. Every generation that looks at the past brings new tools, new questions, new frameworks for understanding what the evidence means. The generation that finally asks the capital question in full, that traces the money through the archives and the shipping records and the commercial correspondence back to wherever it came from, will be doing something that should have been done long ago. But it will also be doing something that could only be done now, with the tools and the frameworks and the historical honesty that the present moment makes available. The stone houses will still be there. That is enough for tonight.